Gideon Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode straight through the gate of the Harmon family's homestead at dawn, 3 weeks before he ever laid eyes on Elias Crowe's land, and he burned their barn to the ground while the children were still sleeping inside it. Not because the Harmons owed him anything, not because they'd crossed him or cheated him, or even looked at him wrong. He did it because their property sat between his ambitions and the valley he intended to own, and they were in the way, and Gideon Voss did not negotiate with obstacles. The youngest Harmon girl was 7 years old. She ran out of the barn in her nightgown, with her hair singed at the ends, and Gideon watched her from his horse without expression, then turned and rode north. He had a different old man to visit. If you've ever watched someone destroy what took a lifetime to build and done it in an afternoon, without shame, without hesitation, then you already know what kind of story this is. This is the story of Elias Crowe. Stay with us until the end. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. These stories take everything we have to make, and every view carries them further than we imagined. Drop a comment and tell us the city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this one travels. Now, let's go back to the ranch. The morning Elias Crowe found the first boot print, he almost didn't stop. He was 61 years old, moving slower than he used to, and his right knee had been giving him grief since February. He was carrying a fence post under one arm and a coil of wire over his shoulder, walking the south pasture line the way he did every third morning, checking for breaks where the cattle might push through. The ground was dry that week. They hadn't seen real rain in almost 2 months, and the soil along the fence line had cracked into pale, papery sheets that crumbled under a boot heel. This was why he noticed it. The crack pattern around the print was wrong. The ground had been moist when someone made that impression, maybe 4 or 5 days earlier, and the edges had dried sharp and clean. Size 11 boot, maybe 11.5, deep heel. Kind of depth you get from a big man, or a man carrying weight. Elias set the fence post down and crouched over it. He was not the kind of man who leapt to conclusions. 30 years of ranching had cured him of that particular habit, if he'd ever had it. Boot print on your land could mean a dozen things. A traveler cutting through, a neighbor checking a boundary marker, a drifter looking for water. He studied it for a moment, noted which direction the toe was pointed northeast, toward the tree line, and then he picked his post back up and kept walking. But he didn't forget about it. That was the thing about Elias Crowe that most people who met him in his later years didn't understand. He seemed slow. He seemed like a man who'd made his peace with the world and didn't particularly need to think hard about anything anymore. He moved deliberately, spoke carefully, and had a face so weathered, and still that strangers sometimes mistook it for vacancy. It wasn't vacancy, it was patience, and patience in Elias Crowe's experience was just a tension stretched across time. He finished the fence line that morning, found 2 broken sections near the eastern corner, where a bull had been pushing, and spent an hour restringing wire in the already building heat. By the time he walked back toward the house, his shirt was dark with sweat, and the knee was talking to him in full sentences. Mara had coffee on. She always had coffee on. She was standing at the kitchen window when he came through the door, looking out at the yard with that particular expression. She got sometimes not worried exactly, more like calculating. She was 58 years old, lean and brown from the sun. With silver hair she kept pinned back while she worked and let down in the evenings. She'd been beautiful when he married her, and she was still beautiful, though differently now. The way landscape is beautiful, with the full weight of weather in it. Bull got through the east corner again, he said, hanging his hat. I know, I saw him in the near pasture this morning. She turned from the window and poured his coffee. There was someone at the ridge last night. Elias sat down at the table. Time, late. After you were asleep, I got up for water and saw a light. Just for a moment. Up near the old Denny Trail. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Could have been a rider passing through. It could have been. She sat across from him. But it was still. Didn't move for the whole time I watched. They looked at each other across the table the way long-married people do a full conversation conducted without a word. Elias had told her things about his past that he'd told no one else. Not everything. There were parts of the years before she knew him that he'd compressed into a single sentence and left there. I did things I'm not proud of, and I left that life behind. She had accepted that sentence without pressing, and over 3 decades, she had never once used it against him. How long did you watch? He asked. Long enough to be sure it wasn't moving. He drank his coffee. Outside, the sun was full up now, hammering the yard flat and white. A hawk was working the thermals above the south ridge, lazy circles, patient as everything in this country. I'll check the Denny trail this afternoon, he said. She nodded and got up to start breakfast, and that was the end of that conversation. But Elias noticed that she didn't go back to looking out the window. She moved with her back straight and her hands steady, the way she always moved when she'd already decided something and was just waiting for the right moment to say it. He found the camp that afternoon. It was set back from the trail maybe 100 yards in a shallow depression where a dry creek bed curved around a stand of juniper. Whoever had used it knew what they were doing. The fire ring was small and had been carefully covered over, the way you do when you don't want smoke visible from a distance. There were 2 sets of boot prints in the softer soil near the creek bed and a flattened area where someone had spread a bedroll. The grass in one spot had been recently cut. Somebody had cleared a sight line toward the southwest, toward the ranch house. Elias stood in that depression for a long time. The juniper smell was sharp in the heat, and somewhere a cicada was hammering away at the silence. He looked at the sight line. He looked at the angle. Then he turned and looked back at his house from that distance, from that elevation, and thought about what you could see from here on a clear morning. Everything. You could see everything. He didn't hurry back. Hurrying would have told someone watching that he'd found something, and he wasn't ready for whoever was out there to know that yet. He walked back at the same pace he'd walked out, swinging the canteen the same way, pausing at the same fence gate. If someone was up in those hills with field glasses, they would see an old man coming back from a walk on a hot afternoon. That was what he wanted them to see. Inside, he went straight to the back room. The room had started as a storage space boxes of old tack, spare lamp parts, seed catalogs going back 15 years. Over time, it had become something else. Not obviously. Nothing in it would have alarmed a visitor. But Elias knew where everything in that room was, and why, and what condition it was in. He checked 2 things, noted that both were exactly as he'd left them, and came back to the kitchen. Mara was at the table, with her mending. She looked up once, and then looked back down at her work. 2 of them, he said. At least. They've been watching the house. She didn't flinch. He'd always loved that about her. How long? The fire ring was old enough that it's been at least a week. Maybe more. Her needle went through the cloth and came back. You know who it is? Not yet. But the camp was set up by someone who knows how to stay hidden. It's not a couple of drifters. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. I need you to think about whether you want to go stay with your sister in Millhaven for a while. The needle stopped. She looked at him over the mending. Do you actually want me to go? I want you to be safe. It's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon wind had come up, pushing at the curtains. No, he said, I don't want you to go. She went back to her mending. Then I won't. That was that. Elias spent the next 3 days doing something that looked from the outside exactly like nothing. He repaired the henhouse. He oiled the hinges on the barn doors. He moved the water trough from the north side of the yard to a position closer to the main gate. He spent an afternoon rearranging the woodpile. He ate his meals, slept his hours, and sat on the porch in the evenings the way he always did. But he was counting. He was counting distances, timing sightlines, cataloging shadows. He walked every inch of his property with fresh eyes, the eyes he'd put away 30 years ago when he married Mara and told himself he was done with that kind of looking. He measured in his mind where a man might approach from cover, where the ground gave natural concealment, where the early light would blind a shooter coming from the east. Thought about angles the way a younger version of himself had thought about them, and found, with a combination of relief and unease, that the geometry had not left him. He also found on the 4th morning a 3rd camp. This one was up on the north ridge, and it was newer. The ash in the fire ring was only a day old. And there were 4 sets of prints this time. 4 men, at minimum. Probably more, and they were moving closer. Elias sat on his heels in the pine duff and looked at the prints and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear. Something older and quieter than fear. Something that lived in the muscles rather than the mind. He recognized it. He'd spent 30 years pretending he didn't know what it felt like. He stood up, brushed the pine needles off his knees, and walked back down to his ranch. The letter came the following morning. It was tucked under a rock at the gatepost, not mailed, not left by a rider he'd seen. Just there as if it had grown from the ground, overnight. The envelope was plain. His name was written on the front in a clean, educated hand, which surprised him. Inside, the message was short. You know why we're here. Ride out by Friday and leave the deed on the table. We won't trouble your wife if you cooperate, GV. Elias read it twice, Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked to the barn. He stood in the barn for a while with the letter in his pocket and his hands resting on the top rail of the stall gate. His old roan was watching him with that unreadable horse patience, switching flies. Elias looked at the horse and thought about Gideon Voss. He'd never met the man, but he'd heard the name, the way you hear names in frontier country carried along by travelers, mentioned in passing at feed stores, attached to incidents that people described in lowered voices. Gideon Voss was maybe 40, maybe younger. He'd come up through cattle brokering in the South and had developed a particular method of expanding his holdings. Find an old claim with a valuable water source, find the person holding it, and make their continued existence inconvenient until they left. He'd done it 4 times in the last decade that Elias knew of. The Harmon farm had been the most recent. What Gideon Voss didn't know, what almost nobody knew anymore, was who Elias Crowe had been before he came to this valley. Elias hadn't told that story in 30 years, not to his neighbors. Not to the men he bought feed from, or the doctor who'd treated his knee, or the circuit judge who'd drawn up his deed. He'd told it once, in condensed form, to Mara, on the night before their wedding, because he felt she deserved to know what she was marrying. She had listened without interruption, and then she had said, "I'm not marrying who you were. I'm marrying who you are." And that had been enough. The man Elias had been before Mara and before the ranch had gone by several names in several territories. He had been, among other things, a scout, a tracker, a hired hand of a kind that required no further description among men who understood such arrangements. He had been very good at surviving situations that killed other men. He had been, at his worst, the kind of person Gideon Voss was now not morally equivalent, he hoped, but functionally similar. Someone who understood violence as a tool, who had learned its grammar so thoroughly that it had become a kind of language he thought in. He had put that language down deliberately, walked away from it. The way you walk away from a knife you've been carrying so long your hand doesn't know it's gone. The knowledge didn't go. Knowledge never goes. GV give him until Friday. Today was Tuesday. He came out of the barn and found Mara waiting on the porch steps. She had a way of knowing when something had changed without being told. He handed her the letter and watched her read it. When she finished, she folded it along the original crease and handed it back. Friday, she said. Yes, that's 3 days. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. How many do you think there are? At least 4. Probably more. The note says we, that's a plural with some confidence behind it. What are you going to do? He looked at the road too. The distance at the end of it where the valley opened up and the sky went wide and blue. I'm going to think, he said, and then I'm going to do what's necessary. She nodded slowly. Elias, when you say necessary, I mean what's necessary to keep us here, on this land, alive. He looked at her. That's all I mean. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite name, not fear, not reassurance. More like recognition, like she was seeing someone she'd known a long time ago and had almost forgotten. All right, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. That night, they sat up late at the kitchen table with the lamp low between them. Elias talked, and Mara listened and occasionally asked questions, and by the time they went to bed the lamp oil was nearly gone. She asked practical questions, distances, angles, which approaches offered cover, what the sunrise would do to visibility along the north fence line. She had grown up on her father's ranch before it failed, and she knew land, and she knew animals, and she was not afraid of hard things. What, she asked near the end, stayed with him as he lay in the dark. Do you think he knows what he's actually dealing with? She said. Gideon Voss. Does he know who you are? He knows the name. He probably knows the old stories. Elias stared at the ceiling. He probably thinks they're exaggerated. She was quiet for a moment. And are they? He thought about that honestly. Some of them, he said. Some of them are probably about right. She turned over in the bed, facing away from him. Then quietly, good. The next morning his son arrived. Caleb Crowe was 34 years old, dark-haired like his mother, with his father's particular quality of stillness when he was thinking hard. Came up the road on a chestnut horse with his saddlebags full of nothing in particular. Caleb traveled light, always had, and found his father mending the south gate in a way that looked, to anyone watching, like routine maintenance. It was not routine maintenance. It was a barricade point, and Elias had been calculating load-bearing tolerances in his head for the better part of an hour. Pa, Caleb said, swinging down. Caleb, Elias kept working. Didn't know you were coming. Wasn't sure I was. Caleb looped his reins around a post and came over to look at what his father was doing. After a moment, what are you reinforcing it for? Gate's been loose. Caleb looked at the gate, which had clearly not been loose for quite some time. He looked at his father. He had grown up in the house of a man who chose his words with extreme care, and he had learned to read what those careful words were covering. Pa, don't start. Something's going on. Caleb. Elias set down his tools and looked at his son directly. How long were you planning to stay? The question landed wrong, and Caleb felt it. I don't know. A few days. Why? Elias looked at him for a long moment. There was something that moved across the older man's face, something complicated and private that Caleb had seen before, but could never quite interpret. Love and worry, and something harder than either. Then it was gone, smoothed back into that familiar, measured calm. Your mother would be glad to see you, Elias said. Go say hello. Pa'll explain things at dinner. Go, Caleb went, but he turned back once, and what he saw was his father standing at the reinforced gate, looking down the road toward the valley. Not with the easy attention of a man watching for nothing in particular, but something else, something older and sharper. He went inside to find his mother, and found her at the kitchen table cleaning a rifle, stopped in the doorway. She looked up at him with an expression of perfect normalcy, as if he'd caught her doing something as unremarkable as folding laundry. Caleb, good to see you. Sit down, hungry. Mama. He looked at the rifle, looked at her. What is happening? She set the cleaning rod down and looked at him steadily. We have a situation, she said. Your father is working out the details. What do you want to eat? I want to know what's going on. You'll know at dinner. She picked up the cleaning rod again. Cornbread or biscuits? He sat down slowly. Biscuits, he said, and watched his mother clean the rifle with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, the same hands, the same expression, the same absolute refusal to be rushed by anyone or anything. Dinner was difficult. Elias explained it simply and without embellishment. A man named Gideon Voss wanted the ranch. He had men watching the property. He had given them until Friday to leave. Elias did not intend to leave. He paused after each of these statements to let them settle before moving to the next one. Caleb's face went through a range of expressions during this recitation that he couldn't quite control. He'd inherited his mother's dark hair and his father's stillness, but not yet, not quite the older man's capacity to receive bad news without visible reaction. How many men? He asked when his father finished. I'm counting at least 6, possibly more. And your Caleb stopped, started again. You're planning to fight them. I'm planning to defend the property, yes. The two of you. The two of us. Caleb set his fork down. Pa, you can't. There are 2 of you and at least 6 of them, and Caleb. His father's voice was quiet and absolutely level. I'm not asking for your opinion on the odds. The silence around the table was the particular silence of a family that has had versions of this conversation before, not this exact one, but ones with the same shape. Caleb looking at his father and wanting to argue, wanting to be heard, and his father looking back with that weathered patience that made argument feel like throwing stones at a cliff face. Then what are you asking? Caleb said. I'm asking you to leave in the morning. Ride to the county seat. Talk to Sheriff Aldrin and explain the situation. Tell him what Voss has done on other properties and see if he'll send a deputy. Caleb looked at his mother. She was eating her dinner with perfect composure. Mama, you agree with this? With which part? With all of it. Staying. With fighting. She looked up at him. This is our home, she said. We built every board of it. Your father and I have been building things together for 35 years, Caleb. If someone tries to take that, she stopped, and for just a moment, something fierce and unconcealed moved through her face. Yes, I agree with staying. Caleb looked at his father again. There was something he wanted to say, had been wanting to say for years, maybe about the distance that had always lived between them, about the parts of his father he'd never understood, about why Elias Crowe had always seemed to know things that other men didn't, to see things that other men missed, to carry something inside him that he'd never named out loud. Standing at that gate, moving through the ranch like a man reading a language in the ground. He didn't say it. Not yet. What he said was, I'll ride at first light. His father nodded. Good, and Pa. He waited until the older man looked at him. Be careful. Elias's expression shifted not much, just a fraction, like a door opening slightly into a room you hadn't known was there. I've been careful my whole life, he said. Sometimes it worked. That night, after Caleb was in his room, Elias went back out to the south yard. The night was clear and the stars were out in force, the Milky Way a pale smear across the middle of the sky. Stood in the yard and looked at his ranch, the house, the barn, the water trough he'd moved, the fence line, the gate, and he let himself see it the way he'd have seen it 30 years ago. Terrain problem. An approach and defense question. A piece of ground with specific properties. It was good ground. It was very defensible ground, in fact, if you knew what you were doing. He thought about Gideon Voss, riding away from the Harmon girls' burning barn, without looking back. Thought about Mara, cleaning the rifle at the kitchen table. He thought about Caleb's face when he'd said, "Be careful," and the way his son's voice had broken very slightly on the word careful, in a way that made it sound more like please. Then he went inside. He did not sleep well, but he slept. And when the dawn came up pale and thin over the eastern ridge, he stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence of the house, his son still sleeping, his wife breathing quietly in the next room, and he understood, with absolute clarity, that he was going to do whatever it took to preserve this silence. Not because he was brave, not because he was what Gideon Voss thought he was, some kind of legend that needed proving, because this was his home, and some things you don't surrender. Not when you've built them with 30 years of your hands and your wife's hands, and the slow, unglamorous accumulation of days that add up to a life. At 5 a.m, while the frost still lay white on the ground, he heard Caleb's horse in the yard. He went to the door and watched his son check the cinch, swing up, settle his hat. Caleb looked toward the house and saw him standing there. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb raised his hand, not quite a wave. Something more deliberate than that. An acknowledgement. Maybe even a beginning. Elias raised his hand in return. Caleb turned his horse and rode north, and Elias watched him go until the sound of hooves faded, and the valley went quiet again. Then he went back inside to his wife and his rifle and his land, and he started to wait. Caleb's horse had been gone less than an hour when Elias found the fourth camp. He wasn't looking for it. He was walking the west perimeter, the stretch of fence line that ran along the base of a long, shallow slope covered in scrub oak and dry grass, and he almost missed it entirely, because whoever had set it up had chosen the site with real intelligence. Not a depression this time. Not a natural hollow. They'd used the shadow of a limestone outcropping to break their outline, and they'd backed the camp against a thicket of cedar so dense it would have swallowed a man whole from 50 yards. No fire ring. Not even a flattened bedroll area. Just 3 things left behind by accident. A tin of tobacco, crimped shut and half buried in the duff at the base of the rock, a stub of candle, melted down to almost nothing and pressed into a thin seam of clay near the cedar line, the clear impression of a rifle stock. Someone had been prone here. Shooting position, pointing southeast, pointing at the kitchen window. Elias crouched and looked at the angle for a long time. The cedar smell was thick in the still morning air, and somewhere up in the scrub oak, a pair of jays were making noise about something. That harsh, rasping complaint they make when something has disturbed their territory. He paid attention to the jays. He turned his head and looked up the slope, following the direction they were calling from. Nothing visible. But the jays didn't call like that at nothing. He stood slowly, with the deliberate ease of a man who has nowhere to be and nothing on his mind, and walked back toward the house at the same unhurried pace he'd left it with. His left hand was loose at his side. His right hand stayed slightly closer to his body than usual, though he hadn't drawn attention to why. Inside, he went to the back room. The Winchester was wrapped in oilcloth on the high shelf behind the spare harness. He'd checked it 4 days ago when he found the first camp, oiled the mechanism, counted the cartridges. He did not take it down now. Not yet. Taking it down now would be a decision with a specific weight and specific consequences, and he wasn't ready to make that decision in the next 30 seconds. Instead was unwrap it, run his thumb along the lever, listen to the action, rewrap it, and put it back exactly where it was. Then he stood in the back room in the dim morning light and thought about the jays. Someone was watching the slope, not from the camp they'd broken camp, or at least pulled back from the shooting position. They were close. The jays didn't care about a bedroll pressed into clay from 2 days ago. Cared about right now. He went back to the kitchen. Mara was at the stove. She looked at him when he came in, registered something in his face, and turned the burner down without being asked. "What?" "There's someone on the west slope, watching the house." He sat. "At least one, might be 2. She was quiet for a moment. "How long have they been there?" "Don't know." "Long enough that the jays noticed." She set the pan aside and came to the table. She didn't sit. She stood with her hands flat on the table surface and looked at him with that focused expression she got when she was working through a problem. "They're not going to wait until Friday." "No," he said. "I don't think they are. Voss sent the letter to give you a deadline." but he's got men in position already. The letter wasn't a warning, Elias said. It was a test. He wanted to see what I'd do when I got it. Whether I'd run or whether I'd stay put and act normal. He looked at his hands on the table. If I'd packed up and left, they'd have followed. If I'd done something panicked, ridden to town, sent for help loudly, they'd have moved in faster. He's been watching the response. And what has he seen? An old rancher who got a note and went back to fixing his fence. Elias almost smiled. Hopefully she was quiet again. Then the boy on the west slope could be a scout, could be a shooter, could be both. They're already in position. She stopped, reconsidered. He has more than 6 men. I think so. Pulled out the chair and sat across from him, and for a moment she just looked at him across the table with that particular quality of attention that had always made him feel simultaneously seen and slightly unnerved. Mara had a way of looking at a problem, any problem, from a sick calf to a broken axle to a 30-year marriage that stripped away everything incidental and went straight to the core of what it actually was. All right, she said, tell me the real number, not the number you've seen, the number you think. He considered that. 8. Maybe 10. She absorbed that without blinking, and the two of us. And the two of us. Outside the morning was warming up, the frost burning off the yard, the sky going from pale gray to a thin, washed-out blue, the kind of morning that would be beautiful under different circumstances. Elias looked out the window at the yard he'd spent 30 years working the packed dirt smooth with use, the fence posts he'd cut and set himself, the barn he'd rebuilt after the fire of '89, the water trough now positioned where a man coming through the gate would walk directly into a narrow, exposed channel of ground. He had not moved the trough because it was loose. I need you to hear something, he said, and I need you to hear it as a fact, not as me trying to manage you. She looked at him steadily. I don't know if we can hold this ground. He said it plainly, without cushioning. 10 men, if I'm right. Even with everything I know, the lay of the land, the approaches, what I've had time to set up, that's not a favorable number. I want you to know that going in. She didn't say anything for a moment. A log shifted in the stove, the flame guttered and came back. Then she said, I know, and you still want to stay. Elias. She leaned forward slightly. You asked me that question the night before we got married. Whether I knew what I was getting into. Whether I understood who you'd been and what that might mean someday. She held his gaze. I told you then that I understood. I still understand. And I'm still here. He looked at her, and for a moment he was not a 61-year-old man with a bad knee and 3 decades of quiet life behind him. He was something older and more essential than that something that existed before the ranch and the years and the careful accumulation of peace. Whatever that thing was, it recognized her across the table and was grateful in a way that went too deep for words. Okay, he said, then here's what I need you to do. He talked for an hour. She listened with her hands folded on the table, asking questions when something needed clarifying, not asking questions when it didn't. She had a practical mind. That was the thing about Mara that most people underestimated because it didn't announce itself. She didn't dramatize. She didn't reframe problems in emotional terms. She identified what was real, and she dealt with what was real. And that quality, Elias had learned over 35 years, was rarer than almost anything. By the time he was done, the sun was fully up, and the frost was completely gone, and the yard looked the way it always looked in the morning, ordinary, clear, already going hot. He went out after breakfast and did his chores, fed the animals, checked the water, split some wood he didn't particularly need, moved slowly, predictably, in the patterns that anyone watching from the ridge would already have cataloged. Meanwhile, Mara went to the root cellar. The root cellar was behind the house, accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor that was covered, most of the time, by the braided rug her mother had made. It was Elias's preferred storage for certain things, not just root vegetables and winter preserves, but the other category of supplies he'd quietly been accumulating over the past decade without making a point of it. Things that a man who'd chosen peace might not logically keep. Things that a man who'd never quite let go of certain instincts would find deeply necessary. Mara had known about those supplies. She'd chosen not to ask about them in any detail, the same way she'd chosen not to ask about the particular clarity with which her husband sometimes described terrain he'd never visited, or the way he occasionally woke in the night with a quality of alertness that bore no resemblance to a man startled from sleep. Some things you knew without the accounting. Some things you carried for each other without making it a conversation. She brought up what he'd asked for. She was systematic about it. She made no unnecessary trips. That afternoon, around 3 o'clock, something shifted on the North Ridge. Elias was in the barn when he felt it, not heard it. Felt it. Change in the quality of the silence. The particular absence of small sounds that meant something large had moved. He set down the bridle he was pretending to repair and went to the barn door and looked out toward the ridge through the gap he'd widened over the past few days by one careful board's width. 3 riders, coming along the ridge line but not over it, staying just below the crest, using the slope to conceal themselves from the house. They were moving slowly, which meant they weren't scouting. They knew where they were going. They were getting into position. Counted the 3, and thought about the one he'd felt on the west slope that morning, and the 4 from the camp 2 days ago, and the mathematics were not comforting. His jaw tightened once, and he let it. Then he went back to the bridle and picked it up and kept working, his hands moving on the leather while the rest of him was completely still inside. Thursday morning, one day before the deadline, Voss was accelerating. That was the thing about men like Gideon Voss. Elias had known enough of them to understand the pattern. They set a deadline not because they intended to honor it, but because they were watching you count down to it. The deadline was the test. If you held your ground quietly, if you didn't panic or run or make loud appeals for help, they took that for stubbornness. And men like Voss responded to stubbornness by moving the schedule up. They didn't like the feeling that someone wasn't afraid of them. It was useful information. He came in for lunch and told Mara about the 3 riders. She listened, then served him beans and cornbread and sat across from him and ate her own lunch with an equanimity that he suspected was partly genuine and partly an act of will. He didn't ask which, he didn't need to. "How long before they move?" she asked. "Tonight, maybe. Or early morning." He swallowed. "My bet is early morning. Men like this prefer the half-dark. Harder to aim at them, and they think you'll be slower. Will you?" "I won't be asleep," he said, "and I won't be slower." She looked at him over her bowl. "What do you need me to do tonight?" "Sleep if you can. You'll need your hands steady in the morning." "And if I can't sleep?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then don't, but stay inside. Whatever you hear, stay inside until I tell you otherwise." Pressed her lips together. Not quite a disagreement. More the expression of a woman who intended to comply with a request she found personally objectionable. "Fine, Mara," I said. "Fine, Elias." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a whole argument happening in that exchange that neither of them voiced, which was probably for the best given that neither of them had time for it. The afternoon went by in segments. Elias worked. Not fake work this time. He'd passed the point where performance mattered. He moved things, checked things, positioned things with the quiet deliberateness of a man who knows that the time for preparation is almost gone. He moved a second rifle to the place he'd identified on the 3rd day, wrapped in oilcloth inside a wooden box, positioned behind the water barrel on the east side of the barn. He checked the angles from the rooftop 3 different times, each time from a slightly different position, until he knew where he'd put himself in the dark. He examined every approach to the house yard, and chose, based on what he'd observed over the past week, where the first and most dangerous threat would come from. It would come from the east. Men who'd spent time watching this property would have noted that the eastern approach offered the most cover, up to the last 50 yards. After that, it was open ground. But 50 yards of cover was enough to stage a real assault, if you had enough men and you moved them fast. He thought about that. He thought about the rooftop. Thought about angles and timing and the particular quality of Thursday evening light at this latitude and season. Then he thought about something else, something he hadn't let himself think about in any sustained way since the letter arrived. He thought about whether any of these men needed to die. Killed men before. In his life before Mara and the ranch, he had done what was required, and he had carried the weight of it in the specific, practical way of a man who understood that weight could either crush you or become something you learned to balance. He didn't glorify it. He didn't pretend it had been clean or right or easy. But he also didn't pretend that the world operated on mercy alone. And he didn't pretend that mercy, in certain moments, was anything other than the luxury of someone who wasn't standing in the particular spot he was standing in. What he genuinely wanted, was for Gideon Voss to make a different calculation, to look at the geometry of this situation and decide that the Crowe Ranch wasn't worth the cost. But men like Voss didn't usually recalculate until the cost became concrete and personal, and Elias had learned a long time ago that you didn't get to choose the rules of the game being played against you. He went inside at dusk and ate supper with Mara. They didn't talk much. What they said was ordinary, the kind of small, precise conversation that 35 years produces, full of shorthand and understood context. She asked him if he wanted more coffee. He said yes. Asked if he'd checked the latch on the cellar door. He said he had. She told him the old gray cat had brought a mouse into the kitchen and left it by the stove as an apparent gift, and he said he appreciated the cat's work ethic. She almost smiled. He went to bed at 9 o'clock and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around him the particular creaks and breathings of a house he knew completely, so thoroughly that any variation in its sounds would have come to him like a word spoken directly in his ear. Mara lay beside him, not asleep, her breathing too controlled for sleep. He didn't tell her he knew. He let her have her silence. He dozed in 20-minute increments, the way he'd learned to do in harder times, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, some part of him always monitoring. At 2 in the morning, he came fully awake and lay still and listened. The night was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. The coyotes that usually worked the South Ridge at this hour were silent. The owls he could normally hear from the big cottonwood at the property edge, nothing. Even the wind had dropped. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a landscape holding its breath. He got up without turning on a lamp. His boots were by the bed. His rifle was leaning against the wall next to the door. He dressed in the dark with the practice of a man who had done this exact thing many times and needed no light to do it. Mara's hand found his arm in the dark. "I heard it too," she said quietly. He covered her hand with his. "Kitchen," he said. "The position we talked about." He felt her nod. She got up and he heard her dress in the dark, same practiced quiet, same absence of unnecessary movement. Thought, not for the first time, that he had married an extraordinary woman and that he had perhaps not told her so often enough. "Mara," he kept his voice very low. "Yes, when this is over." "Tell me then," she said. "Right now I need you paying attention." He almost smiled. Even in the dark, in the middle of the night, with men closing in on their land even then, she was still the most practical person in the room. He went to the window. The yard was empty in the pale light. The moon was 3/4 and sitting high, more light than he would have preferred from a defensive standpoint, but it cut both ways. He could see the gate. He could see the approach from the road. He could see the dark shape of the barn and the fence line and the black band of shadow at the base of the north ridge. He watched the shadow at the base of the ridge. For a long time, nothing. Just the ordinary dark. Just the shape of land at 2 in the morning, silver and black, without motion. Then, very slowly, the shadow moved. It separated from itself, one piece of dark becoming 2, then 3, then resolving into shapes that were not the shapes of land. Shapes that moved with the particular deliberate caution of men who believed they were not being watched. Elias counted 4 of them along the north approach. He moved from the window and went to the east window. Looked out. 2 more. Moving through the scrub at the edge of the east field, angled toward the gate, slower than the north group. They were coordinating, waiting for some kind of signal, some timing that would put them at the fence line and the gate simultaneously. 6 visible, which meant there were more he couldn't see. He went to the kitchen doorway. In the dark, Mara was already at the position they'd discussed low, at the corner of the kitchen wall that gave her a line to the back door and the cellar access both. He could barely see her. She was very still. 6 visible, he said, barely above a breath. North and east. There are more. How long? Minutes. They're staging. He heard her exhale slowly. Controlled. "You remember everything we talked about," he said. Not a question. Every word. He looked at her in the dark, or at the place where he knew she was, the shape of her against the slightly lighter gray of the kitchen wall. He wanted to say something. He couldn't find the words that were the right size for the moment. Everything that came to mind was either too small or too large. "I'll be on the roof," he said. "I know," he went. The access to the roof was through the storage loft above the back bedroom, a fact that no one outside this house would know, because the opening in the roof line was invisible from the ground, covered by a false section of the ridge cap that Elias had rebuilt 3 years ago, for exactly this kind of reason. He had told Mara at the time that he was just fixing a leak. She had looked at him in the particular way she had and not said anything, and they had never discussed it again. Came up through the opening and lay flat along the peak of the roof and let his eyes adjust. From up here, the geometry of the property was completely clear to him. He could see all 4 approach lines. He could see where the shadows thickened at the north fence. He could see the 2 men moving through the east field, closer now. He could see there a 7th shape at the south gate, barely moving, probably meant to cut off any exit. And he could see, coming down the road from the north in no hurry at all, a single rider on a pale horse. Gideon Voss. The man sat his horse with the ease of someone who expected this to be over quickly. Came down the road and stopped at the main gate, and didn't open it, just sat there on the pale horse in the moonlight and looked at the dark house, with an expression Elias couldn't read at this distance, but could imagine. Confidence of a man who'd done this 4 times before. The impatience of a man who'd already moved on mentally to the next problem. He raised his voice, not shouting, projecting. The voice of a man who'd learned that authority sounded like control, not volume. Elias Crowe, I know you're in there. It's past your deadline, old man. You had your chance to do this the easy way. The ranch was silent. Voss shifted in his saddle. Come out front. Leave the rifle inside. We'll make this quick and nobody gets hurt. He paused. Your wife can stay. I got no quarrel with her. It's your signature I need on a document, and then me and my boys will be on our way. The ranch stayed silent. Elias lay on the rooftop with the Winchester resting along his forearm and watched Gideon Voss on his pale horse and thought about what the man had just said. Nobody gets hurt. The same thing he'd probably said outside the Harmon barn. The same words hollow as a dry riverbed. He put Voss in his sights. Then he moved off him, not yet. Voss was visible and exposed and would be easy, but taking him now would scatter the men at the fence lines in ways Elias couldn't fully control. He needed them in the positions he'd anticipated. He needed to choose the moment. Voss waited a few more seconds. Then he made a signal with his left hand, a short, horizontal gesture. The men at the north fence began to move. And Elias Crowe, who had been waiting for precisely this, exhaled slowly, settled his cheek against the stock of the Winchester, and chose his moment. The night cracked open. The first shot was not at Voss. It was at the north fence line, at the lead man who was 3 steps ahead of the others and moving fast, and it dropped him before he'd cleared the fence rail. The next man behind him stumbled, didn't fall. Stumbled, which was different, and Elias was already moving left, tracking, as the group at the east gate broke from their staging position and rushed. The ranch exploded with noise and motion and the immediate brutal chaos of a fight that had been prepared on both sides, but was going badly for only one of them. Gideon Voss on his pale horse wheeled hard and pulled his own rifle, and found nothing to aim at, because the rooftop was silent again, the shadow he'd seen for 1/2 second already gone. The first man went down at the north fence, and the sound of the shot rolled across the valley like something breaking that could not be repaired. Voss's pale horse spun hard, the animal's training, fighting its instinct, and for 3 full seconds the man on its back was searching, scanning the roofline, the windows, the barn door, every place a shot might come from, and finding nothing. That was the thing that cracked his confidence first. Not the shot itself, the silence that followed it. In Voss's experience, men who defended property fired from windows. They fired from doorways. They put themselves where they could see and be seen, because that was what scared people did. They revealed themselves in the act of defending themselves. The rooftop was dark and still. Voss pulled his horse left and shouted a single word, sharp and commanding, and the men at the east gate rushed the fence line in a group. The way he drilled them, bunched together, because bunched men are harder to pick off, one at a time when they're moving fast. That calculation was wrong, and Elias had known it would be wrong, because he'd watched these men stage for 3 days, and he'd seen how they moved together, and he'd planned for exactly the mistake they were making now. He was not on the rooftop anymore. He'd moved the moment he'd fired the first shot, dropping back through the ridge cap, opening into the loft, while the echo was still rolling, coming down the loft ladder in 4 fast steps, and going out the back of the house through the door that opened onto the blind side, the west wall, the one no one had positioned on, because the cedar thicket made approach from that direction difficult. Came around the corner of the house, low and fast, and took up the position behind the woodpile that he'd been considering for 4 days, the position that gave him a clean angle to the east gate at 30 yards. The men rushing the gate were 3 of them, moving in a cluster the way Voss had taught them, and they hit the open ground between the fence and the house yard at a run. Elias fired twice. The first shot took the lead man in the shoulder and sat him down hard in the dirt. The second grazed the man behind him, not a serious wound, but enough to break his stride, enough to make him twist sideways and lose the line he'd been running. The third man pulled up, and for a critical moment he stood in the open yard between the fence and the house, without cover, and without a clear target to shoot at because the muzzle flash had already gone dark. That moment was enough. From the kitchen window, low and to the right of where any of the men would have expected a second shooter, Mara fired. She was not a trained fighter. She had never claimed to be. What she was was a woman who had grown up on a working ranch and had been shooting since she was 9 years old, not for sport, not for show, but because things on a ranch needed killing sometimes, and it was impractical to wait for a man to do it. Coyotes and rattlesnakes and the occasional rabid animal had given her a plain, functional relationship with firearms that had nothing romantic in it. She shot the way she did everything, practically, without drama, aiming for the result and not the gesture. She fired once at the man standing in the open yard. She missed. The shot went wide by 2 feet and threw up a spout of dirt to his left, but it was close enough and unexpected enough that he dove sideways behind the water trough. The water trough that Elias had moved 3 days ago, positioning it exactly where it now sat, at the precise angle from the kitchen window that left anyone sheltering behind it exposed to the east side of the barn. Elias was already moving toward the barn. The night was full of noise now, shouting from the north fence line, where 2 of Voss's men were trying to get to the man. Elias had dropped on the first shot, and more shouting from the road, where Voss himself was making the particular sounds of a man whose plan was unraveling faster than he could revise it. Pale Horse was dancing at the gate, and Voss had his rifle up, but was still searching, still trying to find a fixed target in a fight that refused to present one. Elias reached the east wall of the barn and pressed his back against it and breathed. His knee was hurting. It had been hurting since he came off the loft ladder too fast, something grinding in the joint that sent a spike of pain up into his thigh with every step. He registered it the way he'd once registered similar things as information, relevant and noted, then set aside. Pain was information. It told you what to account for. It didn't get a vote. He looked around the corner of the barn toward the water trough. The man behind it had figured out he was exposed and was crawling slowly, trying not to be heard toward the fence line. He was young. Elias could tell that even in the moonlight, from the way he moved, the particular combination of speed and poor judgment that characterized young men in bad situations. He hadn't been in enough bad situations to know how many of them you caused yourself by moving when you should hold still. Elias let him go. The man was heading for the fence, and the fence was away from the house, and right now Elias had more pressing considerations. From around the south side of the barn came 2 men Elias had not accounted for. That was the mistake. He'd counted 7 outside Voss plus 6, and had tracked 5 of them in the chaos of the first minutes. He'd left 1 unaccounted for, and here were 2, coming around the south barn wall with their rifles up and their eyes on the house, not on the east wall where he was pressing himself flat and very, very still. They passed within 8 feet of him. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He stood against the barn wall in the thick shadow under the eave and let them pass, watching the backs of their heads, counting the distance between himself and the nearer man. 8 feet. 7. The nearer man was wide across the shoulders with a limp in his left leg, old injury, the kind that pulls the whole stride to one side, and he held his rifle carelessly, barrel up, posture of a man who expected to find a frightened old rancher and wasn't yet ready to revise that expectation. They were 10 feet past him when he made his decision. He took the far man first, because the far man was already half turned toward the house and would see the movement if Elias went for the near one. He crossed the distance in 3 steps, and the butt of the Winchester did the work hard and short, at the base of the skull, and the far man went down without a sound, the way a man goes down when the lights simply go out. The near man heard it. He started to turn, and Elias was already moving into him, shoulder first, driving him back against the barn wall with his full weight, and they went against the wall hard, and the man's rifle discharged into the dirt at their feet, a sound that cracked through the yard and drew shouts from multiple directions, and for a few brutal, inelegant seconds it was a close-quarters struggle with no skill to it, just 2 men fighting for control of a rifle and the space between them. Elias was older and slower, but he was also closer, and he'd chosen the angle of the tackle, and the man's right hand was tangled in the rifle strap in a way that limited what he could do with it. Elias got his forearm across the man's throat and leaned in, and the man went to his knees and then the rest of the way down, and Elias stood over him, breathing hard and aware that 3 separate sets of footsteps were now converging on the east side of the barn. He moved. He went through the barn's side door, the one he'd oiled 2 days ago, specifically, and into the interior darkness and smell of horse and hay, and he found the box behind the water barrel by feel alone, unwrapping the oilcloth with practiced hands, and he had the second rifle up and ready by the time the barn door opened. 2 men came in. Not 3-2. The third had peeled off, probably going wide around the barn to the back. The interior of the barn was dark enough that the men in the doorway were outlined by the moonlit yard behind them. They were silhouettes. Elias was darkness inside darkness. "He's in here," one of them said low and tight. "Silas, go wide." "I'll push in from the front." Silas Elias filed the name. The man pushing in from the front came cautiously, more cautiously than the others had, which meant he had better instincts or more experience, or both. He didn't barrel in. He moved along the wall, keeping the stalls between himself and the open barn floor. He was good. Not as good as he thought he was, but good. Elias let him come past the first stall, then the second. At the third stall, Elias's old roan shifted and bumped the gate, the way horses do when something bothers them, and the man swung his rifle toward the sound, a pure reflex, the way anyone would react, and in the half-second, his attention was on the horse. Elias stepped out of the feed-room doorway and took him down with the rifle butt across the forearm, hard enough to crack something. The man cried out, and the rifle hit the barn floor, and Elias put a boot on it and had his own barrel at the man's chest before the echo of the cry had finished. "Don't," Elias said. The man froze. He was breathing in short gasps of pain, and the shock of it, and looking at the rifle barrel with wide eyes. He was maybe 30, thick jaw, 3 or 4 days of beard. Not stupid, Elias thought. Just employed by someone stupider than he was. On the ground, face down, hands where I can see them. The man went down slowly, cradling his cracked forearm. "You're going to get killed," he said. Between the pain and the anger, there was something else in his voice. The beginning of a recalculation. "Maybe," Elias said. "Stay down." He went to the barn door and looked out into the yard. What he saw stopped him for a moment. The yard was in near total chaos. 3 of Voss's men were visible, and none of them were advancing. On the house, one was pulling the wounded man from the north fence, dragging him by his collar toward the gate. Another was behind the fence post, firing at the house windows without apparent target or plan, the shots going wide and high, and doing nothing except making noise and breaking glass. The third, Elias tracked him, was trying to reach Voss's position at the gate, moving along the fence line in short, crouching runs. Voss himself had moved. The pale horse was at the gate still, tied to the post now, but Voss was on foot, and Elias couldn't immediately find him, which was not a comfortable situation. And from the kitchen window, Mara was doing exactly what they'd discussed, not firing unless someone was at the threshold, conserving, not wasting cartridges on shadows. The windows were dark. The house looked empty and still, which was the point, which meant she was doing her job perfectly. He heard a sound behind him from the back of the barn, where Silas had gone. Elias turned. Silas was standing at the rear barn door. He'd come all the way around and come in from the back, and he was standing there with his rifle leveled, and he had the angle, and Elias had turned too late, and he knew it in the instant of turning. The shot went into the barn wall 6 inches to Elias's right. Silas had missed. Not because he was a bad shot. Elias had heard how he'd moved, and bad shots didn't move like that. Silas had missed because he'd hesitated at the critical moment, the quarter second, where the finger was on the trigger and the target was in the sights, and something in Silas's head had flinched. Not the finger, the part that operated the finger. In that quarter second, Elias dropped. He went flat to the barn floor and rolled left, and came up against the base of the stall gate, with the rifle pointed at the rear door. And Silas wasn't there. He'd moved good instincts, moving off the line after he fired, which was the right thing to do, and also meant Elias was now tracking a man in the dark interior of his own barn by sound alone. The roan was agitated, moving in the stall, stamping. Outside, the shooting at the fence line had stopped. The man behind the post had either run out of things to shoot at or had decided to do something else, and the absence of gunfire was somehow louder than the gunfire had been. "I can hear you breathing," Silas said, from somewhere in the rear quarter of the barn. His voice was level, controlled. This was not a frightened man. "And I've got a better angle than you do right now." "Might be," Elias said. He was moving as he said it, a slow lateral slide along the stall wall, keeping his movement underneath the noise of the roan. "You're the one they call Silas." A pause. "Who's asking?" "Just the man who lives here." Another pause, longer. "I heard your name before I rode out here." "Elias Crowe." "That's right. The Voss told us you were a broken-down old rancher that used to have a reputation." Silas's voice was thoughtful now, in the way of a man who is genuinely working through a problem while another part of him stays very alert. "Said it wouldn't take more than a morning." "How's that working out?" Silence, then unexpectedly something close to a short exhale. Not quite a laugh. More the sound a man makes when reality adjusts itself and he's honest enough to acknowledge it. "Not the way he described," Silas said. "No. I imagine not." Elias had found the position he wanted, the corner where the feed room wall met the main barn wall, which put solid wood at his back and gave him clear lines to both barn doors and most of the rear. Stopped moving and settled. "You were in the army," he said. A longer pause this time. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move. The way you came in from the rear. You didn't bunch up with the others when they rushed the east gate. Which means someone taught you not to, and that kind of teaching usually comes from somewhere specific." A silence that stretched into something approaching a minute. Outside someone was shouting, "Voss," by the sound of it, trying to rally the men at the fence line. He sounded angry. He sounded like a man who had not expected to be angry at this point in the evening. "Third Cavalry," Silas said finally, 5 years. Long time ago, long enough. Elias thought about that. A man with 5 years in the 3rd Cavalry would know terrain, would know tactics, would know how to read a fight from the inside. And he would know better than most of the men out there in the yard exactly what had just happened in this barn over the past 15 minutes, and what it meant about the man he was hunting. "You knew something was wrong from the start," Elias said. "Didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Another silence confirmed it anyway. "Trough," Silas said quietly. "Wrong position. And the boards on the south gate. Fresh work. Wrong time of year to be reinforcing gates for no reason." A pause. "Told Gideon it wasn't right. He said I was overthinking it." "He say anything else?" "He said you were old." "I am old," Elias said. "Being old and being dangerous aren't the same category." Somewhere outside, Voss shouted again, a name this time. Not Silas's, one of the others, and Elias heard boots running along the north fence line, moving away from the barn, moving toward the house. He was out of time for conversation. "Silas," he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as something true and not as a trick. Are you listening?" A pause. "I'm listening. I've got 2 men down in this barn, one cold, one with a broken forearm. I've got at least 2 more out of the fight at the fence and east gate. Your friend Voss came here with 9 or 10 men, and he's down to maybe 4 or 5 who can still move, and he doesn't know it yet because the night doesn't give you a full accounting." He kept his voice flat and factual. "You've got military training. You can count. You know what that means about how this ends." Silence. "The men going toward my house right now," Elias continued, "are going to find something they're not expecting, and then the number is going to go down further. And at the end of all this, Gideon Voss is going to be in a much smaller position than he was when he rode up to my gate, and some of his men are going to be dead, and the ones who aren't are going to have to make a decision about what they do next." He could hear Silas breathing in the dark, slow, controlled. "What I'm telling you," Elias said, "is that you still have a decision available to you, but it has a clock on it." The silence that followed was long enough that Elias began to wonder if Silas had somehow moved for the rear door without him hearing it. "Then how many have you actually put down?" 4 down. 2 cold, 2 hurt. The man who was behind the trough ran for the fence. "Hollis," Silas said, almost to himself. "I don't know his name. He'll go to Gideon. Tell him the south approach is clear." Silas's voice was working through the implications. "Gideon will bring everyone left to the front of the house." "That's what I'd expect." "Yes. And your wife's at the front of the house." "My wife," Elias said carefully, "is where she needs to be." Another beat. Then, from somewhere in the dark rear of the barn, the sound of a rifle being slowly, deliberately laid down on the barn floor. A deliberate sound. "Made deliberately. I'm putting it down," Silas said. Elias stayed exactly where he was. "I hear you. I'm not, I want to be clear." Silas's voice had changed. Tactical flatness was still there, but underneath it was something rawer, the voice of a man who has been doing a particular thing for a particular reason and has just now lost confidence in the reason. "I came out here for the money. Voss said it was a land dispute. Easy work. I've done boundary disputes before, they usually don't." He stopped. "The Harmon family. He told us the barn was already on fire when we got there." "Was it?" Silence. "No," Silas said. Elias let that sit where it had landed. Outside, the shouting had consolidated toward the front of the property. Voss had pulled his remaining men to the gate, and Elias could hear him reorganizing, which meant the interval before the next push was short. He had maybe 4 minutes, maybe less. "Stay in the barn," he said. "Don't pick the rifle back up. When this is over, the men still standing are going to have to talk to a sheriff, and the ones who walked away from a fight are going to be in a better conversation than the ones who didn't." He was moving toward the side door as he said it, low and fast. He came out of the barn into a yard that had changed while he was inside. The man with the broken forearm, the one he'd left face down inside, was apparently more capable than his injury suggested, because he'd made it to the fence and over it. and the yard was empty now, except for the two still forms at the north fence, and the man he'd dropped outside with the rifle butt, who was beginning to move, groggily, his hands pawing at the dirt. Elias crossed the yard and took the man's rifle without breaking stride. He reached the west wall of the house and pressed against it and looked around the corner. 4 men with Voss at the gate. 4, which meant the count he'd given, Silas, had already been generous. Voss was in the center of them, on foot, his rifle in both hands, and he was looking at the house with the expression of a man rearranging his understanding of the world at speed and not enjoying the process. He was tall, Voss, with a lean, angular face and the particular bearing of a man who was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a given situation and was only just now encountering evidence to the contrary. Elias looked at the front of the house. The window Mara was using was dark. He couldn't see her, and she couldn't see him, and they had talked about exactly this situation the moment when the remaining force consolidated at the front and pushed, and what each of them would do in the first 10 seconds. They had talked about it in the kitchen at midnight 3 days ago, and she had listened and asked 2 questions and confirmed that she understood the geometry of it. He trusted her. He trusted her completely. That trust was not blind. It was the specific, earned trust of 35 years of watching a person be who they were. Trust didn't stop the muscle under his ribs from pulling tight as he watched Voss gesture toward his 4 remaining men and begin moving them toward the house gate. He had to draw them off. He raised the rifle and fired once at the gate post, not at Voss, not at any of the men. At the post itself, a clean impact that threw splinters and made the pale horse scream and rear against its tie rope. Every man at the gate spun toward the sound, and in the spin they split, half going toward where the shot had come from, half breaking left for cover, and the formation Voss had built in 2 minutes of reorganizing dissolved in under 3 seconds. Elias was already gone. He went back along the west wall, through the blind side, into the house through the back door, and he was through the kitchen and at the front room window in under 30 seconds. The front room was dark. He found Mara by the sound of her breathing controlled, a little fast, but controlled, and he crouched beside her. 4 at the gate, he said. I know, I counted. Her voice was steady. 5th. He came around from the barn side. Fired at the east window, he pulled back. That was the man who was behind the trough. Hollis. Gone now? I don't know. He looked out the window at an angle. The gate was momentarily empty Voss, and his men scattered by the shot, taking cover, but he could hear them repositioning. Voss was good at this. Voss was not going to stay scattered long. Mara. Yes. When Voss comes through that gate, and he will, he's not going to back off. He's going to come fast. He's going to commit everything at once. Last push. She was quiet. The plan holds, he said. Everything we talked about. I know the plan. I know you know the plan. He looked at her in the darkness. She was a shape beside him, the rifle across her knees, her back straight. I just wanted to say it again. Because you're nervous. Because I'm human. She reached over in the dark and found his hand and pressed it once, brief and firm, and let it go. No words. The words would have been too much. The pressure of her hand was exactly the right size for the moment. Then Voss's voice came from the gate and the last push began. He didn't call for surrender this time. He was past that. He simply came walking, not running, which was somehow worse than running. Walking meant deliberate. Walking meant committed. Walking meant the man had made a decision about how this ended and had stopped leaving himself exits. 3 of his men spread to either side, angling for the windows. The 4th Hollis, circling back, came around the south corner of the yard fence. 4 different angles, 4 simultaneous approaches, designed to overwhelm 2 points of fire by sheer geometry. It might have worked. It might have worked against 2 people who hadn't spent 72 hours studying this exact approach, who hadn't moved furniture and repositioned equipment and calculated angles and talked through contingencies until they could recite them without thinking. It might have worked against an old rancher and his wife. The first man to reach a window found the shutter latched from the inside in a way that required 2 hands to force, and those 2 hands occupied with forcing meant a rifle that wasn't in firing position. And in the second that took, Elias fired from the interior dark and the man went down off the porch. Hollis came around the south corner and found the back door locked and reinforced in a way it hadn't been before, and spent 20 seconds he didn't have trying to force it, and in those 20 seconds, Mara moved from the front room to the kitchen and was waiting. She did not miss this time. She shot low, and to the outside of her target deliberately she was not, and had never been. Someone who intended to kill a man who was trying to break into her house. What she intended was to put a round near enough to his feet that he understood the situation in immediate, physical terms, which she did, and Hollis understood the situation, and left. The two remaining men fell back toward the gate. Voss was at the gate when they reached him. He was standing very still, which was not the posture of a man who was in control of the situation, and his face Elias could see it now in the gray light that was beginning to suggest. The East had shifted from the flat authority it had worn when he rode up to something more complicated and less certain. He looked at the house. He looked at his two remaining men. He looked at the yard, where two shapes were motionless at the north fence, and a third was groggily sitting up near the barn. The mathematics of the morning had come out completely wrong. "Voss," Elias said. His voice came from the front door, which he'd opened while Voss was looking at the yard. He was standing in the doorframe, the Winchester in his hands, and the growing gray light was enough. Now that there was no ambiguity about what either man was holding or how either man was positioned. Voss looked at him. Really looked. For the first time, the way you look at something when the category you'd put it in has been demonstrated to be the wrong category. The old rancher, the broken-down legend. The man who should have been in the first easy chapter of a story Voss had told himself about how this morning would go. "You had 9 men," Elias said. His voice was quiet. "Factual. You've got 2 left who can ride and 1 who can't. And I'm standing in my own doorway." He held Voss's gaze. "Do the arithmetic." Voss did not move. A man like Gideon Voss doesn't go down easy, that much was clear. But a man like Gideon Voss also didn't survive to do what he'd done 4 times over by ignoring arithmetic that was pointing one direction with great clarity. 2 men beside him were watching him, not the house, waiting for a signal they weren't sure they wanted to follow. Pale horse moved against its tie rope, and somewhere up in the cottonwood the owls were calling again, the way owls call in the last minutes before the light is full enough to stop them. And from behind Voss, from the barn, walking slowly and without a rifle in his hands, came Silas Vale. Voss turned, stared. Something moved through his face, surprise first, then something that might have been betrayal, then something colder and more considering. Silas stopped 20 feet back and looked at Voss, and then at Elias, and then back at Voss. "It's over, Gideon," he said. His voice was even, the way a man's voice is even when he's stopped, trying to make things come out a different way than they're going to come out. "Do yourself a favor and make it clean." Voss stood at the gate of the Crowe Ranch in the early gray of a Friday morning and held the rifle and looked at the man in the doorway and calculated. Whatever he calculated, it took a long time. Long enough that the light changed perceptibly while he stood there, the sky going from gray to the first pale hint of rose, the valley opening up below the ridge in that particular way it did at dawn, when all the edges softened, and the distance seemed suddenly larger. Then slowly he lowered the rifle, not all the way, not to the ground, just to his side, barrel pointing down, the posture of a man who has not surrendered but who is, for this particular morning, finished with fighting. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Elias agreed. "It's not. But this part is." Mara appeared in the doorway behind him. She stood slightly to his left, the rifle at her side, and she looked at Gideon Voss with an expression that contained no triumph and no anger and no fear. Just the clear, steady look of a woman who had stood in her own house in the dark and not moved, and who was still standing there in the morning after, on the same ground, in the same home. Voss looked at her. He looked at Elias. He said nothing else. He untied the pale horse and mounted, and his 2 remaining men mounted their own horses, and they rode north up the road without looking back. Silas Vale stood in the yard of the Crowe Ranch and watched them go and did not follow. Silas Vale did not leave. That was the first thing that needed deciding, and it decided itself in the minutes after Voss rode north. Elias stood in the doorway watching the pale horse disappear around the valley bend, and then he looked at the man standing in his yard with no rifle and no obvious plan, and he made a judgment call the way he'd been making. Judgment calls his whole life quickly, on incomplete information, with the knowledge that being wrong had consequences he'd have to live with. "Come inside." Silas looked at him. Something crossed his face that was not quite surprise, and not quite gratitude, more the expression of a man who has braced himself for one outcome and received another, and is still catching up to the change. "You sure about that?" "No," Elias said. "Come in anyway." Mara had already moved to the kitchen by the time they came through the door. She was at the stove, which Elias recognized as a deliberate act. She was putting herself in the most useful position available, because useful was how she managed things she couldn't control. Kettle was on. She had set 3 cups on the table, which told him she'd heard him invite Silas in and had decided, in the time it took them to walk from the doorway to the kitchen, that she agreed with the decision, or at least that she wasn't going to oppose it this morning. Silas stopped inside the kitchen door and looked at the cups, then at Mara, then at the kitchen itself, the broken glass from the window that had taken a stray round, the displaced furniture, the small, careful signs of a house that had spent the night as a defensive position. "Sit," Mara said, not unkindly, the way you'd say it to someone who was in shock and didn't know it yet. He sat. Elias sat across from him and looked at him in the full light of the kitchen for the first time. Silas Vale was maybe 40, which was older than Elias had estimated in the barn. He had the particular leanness of a man who'd been moving and working his whole life without ever quite eating enough, and a face that had been weathered by outdoor years into something that looked simultaneously younger and older than his age. His hands on the table were still. That was the detail Elias kept coming back to. In the barn, in the dark, in the middle of a fight, and now hands perfectly still. The training that produced that quality took years and didn't leave. "How many times have you ridden out on jobs like this?" Elias asked. Silas looked at his hands. Voss said they were boundary disputes. 4 times before this, and were they? A pause that contained its own answer. The first 2 were close enough that I didn't look too hard at what they weren't. Stopped. Started again. I needed the work. That's not an excuse. It's just what it was. Mara set cups in front of them and poured without comment. She sat down at the end of the table with her own cup and said nothing, which in Mara's language meant she was listening hard. "Voss gave you a story about me," Elias said, old rancher. "Used to be somebody. Sitting on water rights that controlled the upper valley drainage." Silas wrapped both hands around the cup. He had documentation, territorial land surveys, competing deed claims. Made it look like a legal gray area. It's not a gray area. I know that now. Silas looked up the Harmon farm. When I found out about the girl, he stopped again. The hands tightened on the cup. "I didn't leave then either. That's on me." Elias looked at him. There was a version of this conversation where he said something about accountability, about the weight of choices, about the distance between knowing something was wrong and doing something about it. He didn't say any of those things. He'd lived too long to lecture a man who was already in the middle of a reckoning. "You laid the rifle down," he said. "Lot of good that does anyone." "Does this much good," Elias said. "You're sitting at my kitchen table instead of face down in my yard. And when the sheriff gets here, there's a difference between the man who stopped and the men who rode north with Voss." Silas looked at him for a moment. "You think the sheriff can touch Voss?" "I think the man my son went to get is named Aldrin, and I've known him for 20 years, and he's not the kind of man who lets a thing like Gideon Voss go on principle." Elias drank his coffee. "And I think Voss made a mistake coming here, because everything that happened on this property this morning has witnesses, including me, including you." Silas was quiet. The kitchen clock on the wall ticked him through the ordinary sound that had been there all night through everything and hadn't changed, which struck Elias as faintly absurd. The world kept its regular rhythms regardless of what humans did inside them. "What do you want from me?" Silas said. "I want you to tell the truth when Aldrin gets here. About Voss, about the Harmon property, about all 4 of the jobs before this one, if you know enough about them to be useful." Elias set his cup down. "After that, what happens to you is between you and the territorial court. I won't speak against you." Something shifted in Silas's face. Not relief exactly. Relief would have been too simple. More the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight and had just been told the nature of it was going to be examined in daylight, rather than in the dark where weights feel larger than they are. "Why?" he asked. Elias thought about that honestly. "Because you missed," he said. Silas blinked. "In the barn. You had the angle. I turned too slow. You missed on purpose. And I'd like to believe that means something about the kind of man you actually are underneath the choices you've been making." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the sun was all the way up now, burning the last of the morning cool out of the air. Somewhere a bird was going through its full morning repertoire in the cottonwood. Through the broken kitchen window, Elias could hear the sounds of the ranch, the cattle shifting in the south pasture, the barn cat moving through dry grass, the ordinary small sounds of a morning that had no idea what the night had contained. Mara set her cup down. "There are men in the yard who need looking after," she said, to no one in particular. "Whatever else is happening, that's what's immediately in front of us." She was right. She was almost always right about what was immediately in front of them. The next 2 hours were the kind of work that nobody talks about when they tell stories about fights, the unglamorous, grim, practical work of attending to the aftermath. 3 of Voss's men were still on the property. 1 cold at the north fence, 1 with a broken forearm in the barn, and the man Elias had put down with the rifle butt outside the barn wall, who had regained consciousness and was sitting against the fence post with a pounding head and a profound reluctance to move. Elias and Silas together brought them to the barn. Mara brought water and the cloth she kept for injuries, the same cloth she used for anything that needed fixing, approached with the same practical attention. She was not tender about it, and she was not cruel about it. She dressed the forearm as well as it could be dressed without a doctor, and told the man it needed setting, and he should not move it. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected to be treated considerably worse and was recalibrating. The man at the north fence, Elias, had not known his name and did not learn it then. He had gone in the first minutes of the fight, before anything had been decided. Elias stood over him for a moment and felt the thing he always felt in these situations. Not guilt, exactly, because guilt implied a different decision was available, and no different decision had been available. Something more like the acknowledgement of a cost that was real and not nothing, and that he would carry in the specific, permanent way he carried all the other costs of his life. He covered the man with a horse blanket from the barn. It was all he had available, and it was something. Silas watched him do it without comment. Then he said his name was Creddy, from Amarillo originally, had a sister somewhere. "I'm sorry," Elias said, and he meant it. Meaning it and having made the choice he'd made were not contradictory. He'd learned that a long time ago, though it had taken longer than it should have. They were in the barn when they heard horses on the road. Elias came to the barn door and looked out. 3 riders coming from the north at a canter. For a fractional second his hand moved toward the rifle, and then he registered the shape of the lead rider, the dark hair, the chestnut horse, the particular way his son sat a saddle, and the hand stopped. Caleb. Behind him, 2 men in the brown coats of the county sheriff's office. Elias walked out to the yard gate and waited. He was aware, as he stood there, of what he must look like, a man of 61 who had spent the night on a rooftop and a barn floor and a frozen yard, with blood on his left sleeve from a graze he hadn't bothered to assess yet, and wood dust in his hair from the barn loft, and the particular quality of exhaustion that lived in a man's eyes when he'd been keyed up for hours. And the mechanism had finally been allowed to ease. Caleb pulled up at the gate and looked at him, and then looked at the yard behind him, at the 2 still shapes, at the north fence, at the broken window, at the marks in the dirt that told the story of a night nobody had slept through cleanly. He swung down and came through the gate and stopped 4 feet from his father, and looked at him with an expression that was several things at once, cycling through too fast to name them all. Relief was in there. So was something that looked like anger, though not at Elias, the kind of anger that is really fear that has converted itself into something more manageable. "You're hurt," Caleb said, grazed. "It's nothing." "Let me see, Caleb, let me see, Pa." Elias held out his arm. Caleb pushed the sleeve up and examined the wound with hands that were steadier than his face, which was its own kind of information about his son, the capability that ran below the emotion, the competence that was there when it needed to be. It was a clean graze, shallow and already clotting, and Caleb pressed the sleeve back down and looked at his father and said nothing for a moment. "Where's Mama House?" "She's all right." Caleb closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them and turned to the 2 men behind him and said, "This is my father's property. This is what was done to it." His voice was even flat. The voice of a man delivering facts, who has decided that emotion will have to wait for a more convenient time. The 2 deputies, one older, one young enough to still be surprised by things, looked at the yard and the fence and the window and the shapes under the horse blankets and the man sitting against the fence post with his arm in a sling made of a kitchen cloth. The older deputy, whose name was Hendricks, had been riding with Aldrin's office for 15 years and had the specific quality of composure that job produces. He took in everything without visible reaction, his eyes moving methodically from point to point, the way a man reads a document he needs to understand completely. "Sheriff Aldrin's coming behind us," Hendricks said to Elias. "Hour, maybe 2. He wanted to send someone ahead." He looked at Elias. "You Crowe?" "I am. The man who started all this is named Voss. Gideon Voss. He rode north with 2 men, maybe 2 hours ago." "We know who Voss is," Hendricks said. Something in his voice indicated that the county sheriff's office had been wanting to have a specific conversation with Gideon Voss for some time. "He rode north, you said, toward the upper valley." He'll want to put distance between himself and this property before he thinks about what comes next. He's not going to get enough distance. Hendricks looked at his younger partner, then back at Elias. The man in the barn, the one who stayed, is he going to be a problem? His name is Silas Vale. He'll cooperate. Hendricks absorbed this. Anyone else on the property? 2 in the barn who need a doctor. One. Elias paused, one who's past a doctor. The older deputy nodded once. The nod of a man who has heard that sentence before and has learned to receive it without flinching. Caleb had gone to the house. Elias could see him through the broken window, standing in the kitchen with his mother, and from here he couldn't hear what they were saying. But he could see Mara reach up and put her hand on her son's face the way she'd done when he was small. The way mothers do when the crisis has passed and the body finally understands that it's allowed to feel things again. Caleb stood very still under her hand. Elias looked at that through the broken window for a moment, and then he looked away, because it was private, because some things between a mother and her son don't need a witness. Sheriff Aldrin arrived an hour and 40 minutes later. He was a heavy-set man of 55, with a gray beard he'd been meaning to trim for a decade, and the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had stopped pretending that speed was the same thing as effectiveness. He and Elias Crowe had not been close. Exactly the word for what they were was something more like a long mutual respect conducted at a professional distance. They had dealt with each other honestly over 2 decades, and had never given each other reason to regret it. Aldrin came through the gate and looked at the property the way Hendricks had, methodically, and then he looked at Elias. How bad, he said. 1 dead, 4 hurt, varying degrees. Voss and 2 others rode out intact. Elias looked at him. The dead man was on their side. Everything that happened here was on my land, in defense of my property. Aldrin held his gaze. I'm not here to charge you with anything, Elias. I know. I'm telling you anyway. They walked the property together, Aldrin and Hendricks and Elias, while the younger deputy stayed with the men in the barn and Caleb stayed with Mara in the kitchen. Elias showed them the camps on the ridge, the tobacco tin, the candle stub, the sight lines cleared toward the house windows. He showed them the letter from Voss, still folded in his shirt pocket, and Aldrin took it by the corner and read it, and put it carefully in his own pocket. He showed them the positions, the angles, the things he'd moved, and the things he'd built, and the preparation that was visible, in retrospect, in every deliberate modification to his property over the past week. Aldrin looked at all of it with the expression of a man adding numbers in his head, and when the sum was complete, he looked at Elias with something that was partway between assessment and something more difficult to name. You've done this before, Aldrin said. Not an accusation. Statement. Done what? Prepared a position, read an approach, thought through a fight before it started. The sheriff looked at him steadily. I've known you 20 years, Elias. You're a good neighbor and a fair man, and nobody in this county has a word against you. But what I'm looking at right now is not the work of a man who learned these things ranching. Elias was quiet. I'm not asking, Aldrin said. Whatever you were before you came to this valley is your business, and it was your business before today, and it's your business still. He paused, chose his words. I'm just noting that it's not nothing. What you did here. Most men don't survive 10 to 2. 9 to 2, Elias said, my wife counts. Aldrin looked at him for another moment. Then unexpectedly, he almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but it was genuine. Yes, he said, I imagine she does. The accounting took most of the morning. Aldrin's men documented everything, the boot prints, the fire rings, the abandoned camps, the letter, the wounds, the names of the men in the barn, who gave their names without much resistance. Once Hendricks explained the difference in their situation between cooperating and not cooperating. Silas Vale gave a statement that ran long, and was detailed and implicated Gideon Voss in not only the events of the night before, but in the Harmon fire and 2 additional property disputes that Aldrin had not previously connected to Voss by name. That last part was the thing that changed the shape of everything. Aldrin listened to Silas's statement with the focused attention of a man who was discovering that a problem he'd thought was local has roots he hadn't traced yet. When Silas finished, Aldrin asked 3 precise questions and then sat back and looked at the barn ceiling for a moment. Territorial court, he said, to Hendricks. This is above county jurisdiction now. We need to get a wire to the federal office in Meridian. Hendricks nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing for the past 40 minutes. Voss won't get far, Aldrin said, more to himself than to anyone. Not with what Vale just put on record. He looked at Silas. You understand what you've just done? Yes, Silas said. You've made yourself a witness in a federal land fraud case. That has implications for how you're treated in this matter. Can't promise you anything, but I can tell you it changes the nature of the conversation. I know. Silas looked at his hands on the barn floor where he was sitting. I know. Aldrin stood with the effortful movement of a large man who has been on the ground too long. He looked at Elias. I need you to come to the county seat and make a formal statement. Not today. Today you stay home and tend to your property. But within the week I'll be there. Your wife too, if she's willing. She'll be willing. Elias almost smiled. She may have more to say than I do. Aldrin picked up his hat from the stall gate where he'd set it. One more thing. He looked at Elias with the directness of a man who is going to ask something plainly and expects a plain answer. Voss said this isn't over when he left. Did you believe him? Elias thought about that. About the way Voss had stood at the gate, the rifle at his side, not surrendered. Specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who had made peace with a loss. I believe he means it, Elias said. Whether he can follow through on it is a different question, depending on how fast you move. Then we'll move fast, Aldrin said. They did. The federal wire went out from the county seat that afternoon. By the following morning, a pair of territorial deputies were on the North Road. Gideon Voss, it turned out, had not gotten far. He'd stopped at a way station 12 miles out to rest the horses and treat the wounded man he'd brought with him. And the territorial deputies found him there in the early afternoon, sitting at a table in the way station's front room, eating a meal with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was not untouchable. He had not been untouchable for some time. As it turned out, he had simply operated in spaces where the connections between his various activities were not yet visible to any single authority. Silas Vale's statement made the connections visible. And once you could see the whole shape of it, the pattern of deed disputes, the fraudulent land surveys, the intimidation of homesteaders across 3 counties, the Harmon barn, the shape was damning in a way that no single event would have been on its own. Voss was taken into federal custody in the way station's front room, still holding his fork, with the meal half finished in front of him. Elias didn't hear about that until 2 days later, when Aldrin sent a writer out with a note. He read the note at the kitchen table with Mara across from him, and when he was done, he set it face down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. Well, Mara said. Well, Elias agreed. She refilled his coffee. He looked at the window, the broken one, now covered with a board until the glass could be replaced, and at the yard beyond it, which looked ordinary and peaceful in the afternoon light, the way it had always looked, the way it would continue to look. The fence post standing, the barn doors level, the water trough in its new position, which he supposed he ought to move back, but found he had no particular urgency about. That evening Caleb was still there. He'd stayed without being asked, which was its own kind of statement. He'd spent the day doing what needed doing, helping clear the north fence, moving materials, checking on the animals that had been unsettled by the night's noise. He worked the way his father worked, quietly and with attention, without announcing what he was doing or waiting for instructions. Elias had watched him at intervals throughout the day and had felt, each time, the particular complex feeling he associated with his son, love threaded through with regret, affection layered over the years of distance between them that he knew he'd partly created. After supper, they were on the porch. Mara had gone in early. She was tired in the deep, physical way of a person who had been absolutely present for something enormous and was now spending the cost of that. Elias and Caleb sat in the 2 chairs with the evening coming down around them, and for a while, neither of them said anything. The valley was doing what it did at this hour, cooling down, turning the colors of the grass from gold to a softer, grayer tone, the shadows from the west ridge stretching long and blue across the lower pasture. The cattle had settled. The barn cat was on the fence rail. Somewhere down the south pasture, the old roan was moving slowly through the grass with his particular unhurried dignity. I want to ask you something, Caleb said, and I want you to actually answer it. Elias looked at the valley. All right, who are you? Before you came here. Caleb's voice was careful. I've had my whole life to wonder about it, and I've asked you before and gotten half an answer. And I think he stopped. I think after last night I'm old enough to hear the whole one. Elias sat with that for a moment. He'd known this question was coming, not because he'd expected it specifically after last night, but because he'd always known, in the way of a man who has deferred something long enough, that the deferral was going to end. I did work, he said, that needed doing in places where the law wasn't yet what it is now. Scouts sometimes, tracking sometimes, working for people who needed someone who understood how violence worked and how to manage situations before they became worse. He paused. Sometimes they became worse anyway, and I managed that too. Caleb absorbed this. Were you, did you? He stopped. Reorganized. Were you a good man then? The question was not what Elias had expected. He'd expected something more specific, more about actions and events. It was harder. I was trying to be, he said. I didn't always succeed. There are things I did that I can't make right, because the people they affected aren't here to make it right with. I left that life not because I was run out of it, but because I looked at what I was becoming and didn't recognize it, and I decided I'd rather be someone else. He looked at his hands on the chair arms. Your mother knew. I told her before we were married. She made her choice with full information. And you built all this. We built all this. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The evening was very still last night, he said. When I rode up and I saw the yard, and I saw he stopped. His voice had changed, and he let it change rather than correcting it. I thought I was afraid that you were... I know, Elias said. I don't want you to die thinking that I don't. Caleb stopped again. He was struggling with something, and Elias recognized the struggle because he'd seen it in the mirror often enough, the difficulty of saying the thing that was real when you'd spent years communicating around it. I know, Elias said again. Quieter, Caleb looked at him. His face was his mother's face mostly, but in certain angles, at certain hours, there was something in it that Elias recognized from inside. Why didn't you ever tell me about who you were? Because I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. Caleb blinked. How am I looking at you? Like I might be someone different than who you thought I was. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his face, a sequence of things, too fast to track, the way a man works through an understanding that is changing the shape of something he'd held for a long time. You're not, he said finally. You're exactly who I thought you were. He turned back to the valley. I didn't know there was so much more of you than I could see. They sat with that for a while. The evening settled deeper. The jays were done for the day, and the owls hadn't started yet, and in between there was that particular quality of quiet that belongs only to that exact interval, the held breath of the day between what it was and what the night will make of it. Are you afraid he'll come back? Caleb said Voss. Voss is in federal custody. He's not coming back. I mean, someone like him, someone else. Elias thought about that, honestly. No, he said. Not particularly. The water rights on this property are documented clearly, and they've been challenged now and survived. Anyone who looks at what happened here this week and decides the Crowe Ranch is an easy target. He paused. They've misread the situation. Caleb made a sound that might have been a laugh. Small, brief, but real. That's one way to put it. The accurate way. Another silence. Comfortable, this one, in a way the earlier silences between them hadn't quite been. Something had shifted, not fixed, because 30 years of partial distance doesn't get fixed in a porch conversation, no matter how honest. Shifted. The way ground shifts when water finally gets into a crack, not dramatic, not sudden, but real and permanent. I'm going to stay a few more days, Caleb said. Help with the fence and the window. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Elias looked at his son in the evening light. Your mother would be glad of it. What about you? A pause, long enough to be honest. I'd be glad of it too, Elias said, if you want to know. Caleb nodded once. He looked like a man who had wanted to hear exactly that for a long time, and was now working out what to do with having heard it. Okay, he said. Then I'll stay. Inside, Mara was already asleep. Elias could tell from the quality of the house's silence the particular hush it had when she was resting. He sat a while longer with his son in the cooling evening, not saying much, watching the last light leave the valley and the first stars come out above the east ridge. The same stars that had looked down at everything that had happened in the last week and would look down at whatever came next with the same patient indifference they'd always had. Thought about Silas Vale, who was in county custody now, and would have a conversation with a territorial court that might go badly for him or might not, depending on how the arithmetic of his choices against the choices he'd changed stacked up. He thought about the man he'd covered with a horse blanket at the north fence. Thought about Gideon Voss eating a meal at a way station table, with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond consequence, and what his face had looked like when that belief had been corrected. He thought about Mara, cleaning the rifle at the kitchen table on the morning. All of this began with the absolute, unapologetic practicality. That was the thing he'd loved most about her, from the first, and never stopped loving. He thought about the years, the long, accumulating years of this ranch and this life, and the 1,000 daily unremarkable things that added up to everything. Stars were out fully now, the Milky Way beginning to show above the ridge, faint and immense and completely indifferent to the specific drama of the Crowe Ranch and everyone who had passed through it in the last week. Elias sat under it in the chair on his porch, on his land, with his son beside him and his wife sleeping inside, and he felt the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable weight of what he had and what he had kept. His knee hurt. The graze on his arm had stiffened. He needed a full night's sleep in an actual bed, and tomorrow there was fence to repair and glass to replace, and a dozen other small demands the ranch made regardless of what had happened. He was, in every physical and logistical sense, exactly where he'd been a week ago. The difference was something that didn't have an easy name. The difference was in the quality of the silence, which had been tested now and had held, and which he understood in a way he hadn't before what it had taken to build and what it was actually worth. Caleb shifted in his chair. Pa, yeah, thank you. A pause. For I don't know exactly what for. For being here, I think. For still being here. Elias looked at his son, at the dark hair and his mother's face, and the 34 years of a life he'd watched from the imperfect, sometimes too far distance of a man who hadn't always known how to be present in the ways that mattered most. He felt the weight of what he could have said and didn't over all those years, and the weight of what had been said tonight, and the way those two weights sat against each other in a way that was uncomfortable and necessary and real. Go get some sleep, he said. Yeah. Caleb stood, stretched, put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder, just a moment, just the pressure of it, and went inside. Elias sat alone on the porch for a little while longer. The night was full around him. The ranch breathed its familiar rhythms. Out beyond the fence line, the valley went dark and wide and quiet, the same as it had always been, indifferent and permanent in his. He sat until the cold got into his knee and made the argument that bed was a better idea than the chair. Then he went inside to his wife and his house, and his life, and pulled the door closed behind him. The glass for the kitchen window came from the hardware supplier in Millhaven, carried out by the feed wagon on its regular Thursday run, wrapped in burlap and straw the way fragile things are wrapped when they have to survive a road that doesn't care about them. Caleb carried it from the wagon to the house himself, walking carefully, and Elias watched his son move through the yard with that particular attention you give to something breakable, and thought about how long it had been since he'd watched Caleb do anything at all. Too long. The answer was too long, and he knew it, and knowing it didn't change the arithmetic of the years, but it changed something about how he held them. They set the glass together, the two of them, Caleb on the outside, with the pane held level, and Elias on his inside running the putty knife along the frame the way his own father had shown him 60 years ago, in a different state, in a different life. The work was simple and specific and required just enough coordination that they had to talk to each other. Small, practical talk. Kind that isn't about anything except the immediate task, and is somehow for that reason easier than the real kind. Little more to the left, Elias said. This left or your left? My left. You're right, that's what I said. You said my left. I meant you're right. Elias ran the knife along the edge. You always did that, said the wrong direction, and then argued about it. Caleb snorted. I was 8. You could have been more patient. I was plenty patient, Pa. You made me resplice that fence wire 4 times, because the tension wasn't right. Tension wasn't right. I was 8 years old. Elias pressed the putty into the corner. Fence doesn't care how old you are. There was a silence. Then Caleb laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has decided to stop bracing himself against something. Came out of him and filled the gap between them and dissipated into the morning air and left something cleaner behind. Mara appeared at the door of the kitchen. She looked at the two of them, at the laughter she'd heard from inside, at the window going back into its frame, and her face did something private and complex that she smoothed away before either of them could fully see it. But Elias saw enough. Coffee's on, she said. Don't drop that glass. We're not going to drop it, Caleb said. Your father dropped the last one. I was replacing it alone, Elias said. Different circumstances. Different result too, if I recall. Come in when you're done. She went back to the kitchen, and Caleb looked at his father, with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something warmer and less categorizable. Elias focused on the putty. The glass settled into the frame with the precise, solid fit of something correctly done, and for a moment he just looked at it, the new pane, clear and clean, the yard visible through it, the ordinary morning light coming straight through without the distortion of a crack or the gap of a missing piece. Things could be repaired. That was not a small thing to know. Some things couldn't, and you learn to live with those, But a surprising number of things could be put back together by people who were willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of doing it. They had coffee, the three of them at the kitchen table, which was where most of the real things in this house had always happened, the decisions, the arguments, the silences that said more than speech, and now this, which was harder to name. Not reconciliation exactly, because reconciliation implied a wound with clean edges, and the distance between Elias and his son had never had clean edges. It was more like what happens when a landscape recovers, after a drought, not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow return of things that had always wanted to grow. Caleb stayed 4 more days. He fixed the north fence properly, resetting 2 posts that Elias had been meaning to get to since spring. He rehung the barn's side door, which had been sitting fractionally off level for 2 years, and which Elias had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a sound you've heard long enough. He helped Elias move the water trough back to the north side of the yard. Took 20 minutes and a conversation about leverage that somehow became a conversation about the summer. Caleb was 12 and had tried to move a boulder from the creek bed single-handed and had spent 3 hours in the attempt before Elias had come down from the upper pasture and shown him what a pry bar was for. "You didn't laugh at me," Caleb said. "Of course I didn't laugh at you. You wanted to." Elias considered this. Maybe a little. "Why didn't you?" "Because you were working hard at something you believed in." He set his end of the trough down. "That's not something you laugh at." Caleb stood with his hands on the trough rim and looked at his father. The look lasted long enough to be deliberate. "You never told me that." "Told you what?" That was why. That you saw that about me. That I was working hard." He looked down at his hands. "Thought you didn't say anything because you were disappointed that I'd failed." Quiet. He thought about the boy at the creek bed, 12 years old, and determined in the way that 12-year-olds are determined without strategy, without tools, but with a completeness of commitment that adults often lose and rarely recover. He thought about watching him from the upper pasture, and choosing not to intervene too soon because there was something worth preserving in that effort, even in its failure. He hadn't said any of that at the time. He'd come down eventually and shown him the pry bar, and the boulder had moved, and they'd walked back to the house, and he hadn't said it. He didn't know why he hadn't said it. He knew the general shape of why, the particular difficulty he'd always had with the sentences that contained the most important things. But knowing the shape didn't explain it well enough to be satisfying. "I wasn't disappointed," he said. "I should have told you." Caleb nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing something away, not dismissing it. "Yeah," he said, "you should have." That was as close as they came to the direct accounting. It was enough. 30 years of distance doesn't close in 4 days. And both of them knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But something had been acknowledged that had needed acknowledging, and the acknowledgement was real, which made it worth more than a larger gesture that wasn't. On Caleb's last morning, he saddled the chestnut horse before breakfast, the way he always did when he was leaving. He'd had the habit, since he was young, of getting the practical thing done before the emotional one, so that when the emotional thing arrived, he wasn't thinking about the practical thing. Elias had taught him that without meaning to, by example, and recognized it in him now with a complicated feeling. Mara made a full breakfast. Eggs and bacon and biscuits and the good jam she kept for company, which Caleb was and wasn't, depending on how you measured. They ate, and the conversation was ordinary, and when Caleb pushed back from the table and said he needed to get on the road, Mara stood and took his face in her hands the way she always had since he was a boy, and looked at him for a moment and let him go. Elias walked him to the gate. At the gate, Caleb checked the cinch out of habit, tightened it a notch, and then turned and looked at his father. The morning was clear and already warm, the sky going that particular deep blue that meant the day would be hot. Behind them, the ranch sat in the morning light, the house with its new window pane, the barn with its level door, the fence line running straight and true along the pasture edge. "I'll come back sooner," Caleb said, "than I usually do. I'd like that. Maybe in the fall, before the cold comes. Fall is good. There's work in the fall." Caleb smiled at that, the specific smile of a man who has heard his father speak this exact language his whole life, and has finally at 34 understood that work was the way Elias Crowe said, "I want you here." "I know there's work," he said. "That's fine." He mounted. He looked down at his father from the saddle. "Take care of her," he said. "Not that she needs it. She doesn't," Elias agreed. "But I will." Caleb raised his hand. The same gesture he'd made riding away a week ago. Before all of it, the same hand. The same morning light, a completely different weight behind it. Elias raised his in return. Caleb turned the chestnut north and rode, and Elias watched him go until he was small on the road, and then gone where the valley curved, and then he stood at the gate for a moment longer, in the quiet that followed. The difference between this watching and the last one was something he couldn't entirely quantify. Last time he'd watched his son ride away, carrying the weight of a father he didn't fully know, toward a sheriff who might or might not return in time. This time he watched his son ride away, carrying the weight of a father he knew a little better, toward a life that would bring him back in the fall. The road was the same. The morning was the same. The difference was entirely in what had been said and done in the days between. That turned out to matter. It turned out to matter more than he'd expected. 3 weeks after the night of the fight, a rider came from the county seat with a formal letter from the territorial court. Elias read it at the kitchen table while Mara peeled potatoes and pretended not to watch him. Gideon Voss had been formally charged on 7 counts, 4 counts of fraudulent land claim filing, 2 counts of criminal intimidation, and 1 count of arson relating to the Harmon property. The territorial court had accepted jurisdiction. A trial date had been set for the spring term. Voss was being held in federal custody in Meridian and would not be released pending trial. There was a second letter, shorter, from Aldrin. It said that Silas Vale's cooperation had been formally noted by the territorial prosecutor and that Vale's own charges, criminal trespass, conspiracy, would be treated with consideration given his testimony. It said that the 2 men who had ridden out with Voss had been located and detained at a relay station 2 days' ride north. It said that the Harmon family had been notified that the man responsible for their barn was in custody and that they would be called as witnesses. Aldrin had added a handwritten line at the bottom, outside the formal language. "You and your wife did a hell of a thing. Don't make a habit of it." Aldrin Elias put both letters down and looked at the table. "Well," Mara said, he told her. She peeled another potato. She peeled it all the way around in one long strip the way she'd been doing since he'd first watched her do it 36 years ago, across a different table, in a different kitchen, when he'd been a different, harder version of himself, and she had been the thing that made him want to be otherwise. Potato skin came off clean, and she set it aside and started on the next one. "Good," she said. "That's all. What else is there to say?" She looked up at him. "He's in custody. The Harmons know the land is ours." She looked back at the potato. "Good." Elias sat back in his chair. He thought about what else there was to say, and found she was right, as she frequently was. That good covered most of it adequately. The rest was feeling, and feeling didn't require words to be real. There was one more thing, though, one thread still out there in the world that hadn't yet resolved itself, and he found himself thinking about it more than he expected to. Silas Vale. The territorial court held its preliminary hearings in late October. Elias and Mara made the 2-day ride to the county seat together, which they hadn't done in years, not since a sand survey dispute in 4 that had been settled without drama in a county registrar's office. The ride was uncomfortable, because the road was bad in October, and the wagon springs were not what they'd been, and Mara pointed this out twice. And Elias said he'd look at the springs when they got back, and she said he'd said that last spring, and he said the springs had been fine last spring, and she said they hadn't, and he said they argued mildly for about 6 miles, and then ran out of things to disagree about, and rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, which was the natural terminus of most of their arguments. County seat was a town of several thousand people, large enough to have a proper courthouse with stone steps and tall windows, and the territorial judge who had come out from Meridian for the preliminary hearings was a woman named Hargrove Elias, hadn't known that, hadn't expected it, and noted his own brief surprise with the specific self-awareness of a man who knows his assumptions have been outpaced by the world and finds this more interesting than embarrassing. Judge Hargrove was in her 50s, with a gray-streaked braid and the particular composure of a person who has spent years being underestimated and has learned to find it professionally useful. The hearing for Silas Vale was brief. The territorial prosecutor laid out the charges and the cooperation, and Judge Hargrove asked questions that were precise and revealed, in their precision, that she had read everything available to her and formed opinions she wasn't sharing yet. Silas sat at the defendant's table in clothes that were clean but not new, and he answered every question directly and without elaboration, the way a man answers who has decided that the truth is the only remaining thing he has control over. When the prosecutor finished, Hargrove looked at Elias. "Mr. Crowe," she said, "you submitted a statement to this court on behalf of Mr. Vale. You'd like it on the record that you do not seek prosecution of the charges against him?" "That's correct," Elias said. "And your wife holds the same position?" Mara beside him said yes. Hargrove looked at them both for a moment. Then she looked at Silas Vale. Mr. Vale, you are not a man who stumbled into a bad situation. You made choices repeatedly that you understood to be wrong. That is in your statement, and I will hold you to it. She paused. You also made a choice at a critical moment to stop, and the court takes note of what that choice cost you in practical terms and what it produced in terms of this prosecution. Another pause. I am not dismissing the charges. I am suspending sentencing pending a period of probationary oversight, contingent on your continued cooperation with the territorial court on all matters related to Gideon Voss and his associated activities. If you breach that condition at any point, we will have a different conversation. Silas said, understood. Do you have anything you'd like to say to this court? He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked briefly at Elias and Mara, not asking for anything, not looking for rescue, just looking, the way a man looks at a thing that changed the direction of his life and wants to remember it clearly. I had a chance to do the right thing earlier than I did, he said. I didn't take it. I'm glad I eventually took it. I don't think that makes me a good man. I think it makes me a man who, given one more chance than I deserved, managed to do the right thing. He looked back at the judge. I'd like to do more than one right thing before I'm done. Court will allow it. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Court is allowing it, she said. Don't squander it. Elias and Mara rode home the following morning. The road was still bad, and the springs were still inadequate, and they argued about the springs again for approximately the same distance before arriving at the same silence. The valley came into view in the late afternoon. From the top of the ridge road, the long amber sweep of it, the river line glinting in the low autumn sun, the scatter of homesteads along the valley floor, and there, at the south end, the particular arrangement of buildings and fence lines and cleared pasture that was theirs. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop at the ridge overlook, which he'd never done before, not once in 30 years of making this ride. Mara looked at him. What, she said. He nodded at the valley. She looked. He watched her look at it, watched her take it in, the whole of it, the scale of it from up here where you could see how it fit into the larger landscape, how it sat in the valley between the ridges, how it was both small against everything around it and exactly sufficient to itself. Her face did the thing it did sometimes when she wasn't managing it for anyone's benefit, when she was just a person looking at something real. Face he loved. He had loved it for 36 years, and it had never stopped being true. Good land, she said, it is. We built something good on it. We did. She looked at it a little longer. Then she looked at him. Elias. Yeah, you said that night before it started. You said when it was over, you'd tell me something. Thought back. The dark kitchen, the lamp running low, her hand finding his arm. Tell me then, I remember. It's over. He looked at her. The face that had been looking back at him across 36 years of mornings and arguments and silences and the 1,000 daily negotiations of 2 lives that had decided to become one life. He thought about what he'd wanted to say in that dark moment and whether it was still the right thing to say now that the crisis was resolved. And the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon made it harder to say the large things without them sounding smaller than they were. He said it anyway. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Not the fighting. Not the 30 years before the fighting. Not the thing I'm trying to be that's better than what I was. He looked at the valley. I know I don't say that kind of thing enough. I know I'm better at fence posts than at this. But I wanted you to know that I know it. She was quiet for a moment. Kind of quiet that absorbed something rather than deflecting it. I know, she said. I figured you did. I still wanted to hear it. I know that too. She put her hand over his on the wagon seat. Not the brief, firm pressure of the dark kitchen, before the fight something longer and quieter, and more like the thing it actually was, which was 36 years of choosing the same choice, morning after morning, in the unglamorous and unremarkable accumulation of days that add up to a life. Turned his hand and held hers. They stayed at the overlook until the light changed. Then he clicked the horses forward, and they went down the ridge road toward home. November came in cold, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms, the earlier dark, the heavier work of keeping animals warm and watered, the mornings when the frost was so thick it made the yard look like a different country. Elias's knee had not gotten better since the night on the rooftop and the loft ladder. He'd seen the doctor in Millhaven at Mara's insistence, and the doctor had said the words significant wear and be careful on stairs, and Elias had listened with the patient tolerance of a man who has no intention of being careful on stairs, but understands the social necessity of appearing to consider it. He was careful on stairs, a little. The Winchester stayed where it had always been, on the high shelf in the back room, wrapped in oilcloth. He didn't move it to a more accessible position, and he didn't take it down to check it the way he'd been doing in the weeks before the fight. He left it where it was. This wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't frame it to himself as putting away violence or turning a page, or any of the things that stories do to private acts that don't require that kind of weight. He just left it on the shelf. It was enough to know it was there. He didn't need to keep checking. A letter came from Caleb in mid-November. 3 pages, which was unusual. Caleb was not, as a rule, a long letter writer. He wrote about his work, which was land surveying in the northern counties, and about a woman named Ruth he'd been seeing since summer who had a practical intelligence that reminded him. He wrote of his mother, and then he'd apparently reconsidered that sentence and crossed it out, but not so thoroughly that it couldn't be read, which Mara read aloud at the dinner table, with a quality of satisfaction she made no effort to conceal. In the last page, Caleb wrote about the fall visit he'd promised. He would come in December, he said, if the roads permitted. He would bring Ruth, if Elias and Mara were willing to have her. He said he wanted her to see the ranch. He said, and this was the part that Elias read twice, alone. After Mara had gone to bed, he said he'd been thinking about the conversation on the porch, the things that had been said, and the things that hadn't been said in 34 years. And he wanted Elias to know that he'd spent his whole life trying to understand who his father was, and that he thought now he was starting to, and that understanding it made him proud in a way he didn't have the exact right words for, but was going to keep trying to find. Elias folded the letter and held it for a while. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was up, pushing at the corner of the house with that particular voice it got in November, when the cold was serious, and the valley contracted around itself against the coming winter. He thought about the man he'd been. He thought about the man he'd tried to become. Thought about the distance between those two men and all the ground between them that was neither the one nor the other, but some third thing that didn't have a single name, the long middle country of a life, where most of the real work happened. He thought about something he'd heard, once, a long time ago, from a man whose name he'd forgotten, one of the many men he'd worked alongside in the years before the ranch, in the territories, in the spaces between law and order where men like him operated. The man had said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone stating something obvious, the only way to stop being who you were is to keep being who you're trying to be, every day, until it's the same thing. At the time, Elias had filed it away with the other pragmatic wisdoms of a life lived in difficult conditions. He hadn't thought about it in decades. He thought about it now. He wasn't sure he'd gotten all the way there. He wasn't sure a man ever fully closed that gap between who he'd been and who he was trying to be. What he was sure of was that the trying mattered, that it wasn't nothing. That 30 years of ordinary daily choices to be different added up to something real, even if they didn't add up to something clean and complete. The damage he'd done in the years before Mara and the ranch had not been undone by the years after. It couldn't be undone, but it had been partially, imperfectly, in the way of real human change, rather than the story kind weighted against by the life he'd built and the man he'd worked at being in it. That was the accounting. Imperfect and real, like all the ones that mattered. He put the letter in the tin box, where he kept things that needed keeping, and blew out the lamp and went to bed. December came with weather that threatened to close the roads, and then relented, and Caleb arrived on a Thursday morning with Ruth Callahan beside him on a gray mare, Ruth being a composed woman of 31 with reddish hair, and the particular quality of directness that makes some people nervous and makes other people, the ones worth knowing, feel immediately at ease. She shook Elias's hand at the gate and looked him in the eye and said she'd heard a great deal about the ranch, and her voice said that she'd heard a great deal about more than the ranch. And she was the kind of person who absorbed information, without announcing that she'd absorbed it. Mara liked her immediately. Elias could tell from the way his wife looked at her, the quick, assessing look that meant she was taking measure, followed by a slight relaxation of something around her shoulders that meant the measure had come out well. They stayed a week. The days had the particular texture of days when there is enough company and enough work and enough conversation, and also enough silence when things are being built between people at the pace that building actually requires, which is never as fast as anyone wants and always is exactly as fast as it can go. Elias and Caleb fixed the last of the fence line together. Mara and Ruth had conversations in the kitchen that Elias caught fragments of and didn't inquire further into, recognizing them as the kind of conversations that needed their own space. On the second-to-last evening, Elias and Caleb were in the barn. the cold outside pressing against the walls, the animals warm and settled in their stalls. They weren't talking about anything particular, just the work, the horses. The question of whether the north pasture gate needed replacing in the spring or could be made to last another year. Kind of conversation that is mostly about being in the same place at the same time, which is itself a thing. She's good for you, Elias said, not angling into it, just saying it. Caleb looked up from the gate hinge he was examining. Yeah, she looks at you, like she sees you clearly and isn't bothered by what she sees. That's not a small thing. Caleb was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it's not. He looked back at the hinge. I was thinking not for a while, but eventually, I was thinking about whether there's land available in this valley. I mean, available to buy. Elias went still. Not right next door, Caleb said quickly. I know you don't need anyone right next door. But in the valley, within riding distance, he set the hinge down. Spent my whole life riding away from this place. I'm not sure that was the right call. Elias looked at his son. The lamplight in the barn was warm and low, kind of light that softens everything, and Caleb in that light looked both very young and older than he had any right to be. Combination was, Elias supposed, what 34 years looked like on a face that had his wife's bones and his own particular quality of stillness. There's the Denny parcel, Elias said carefully, north of the upper pasture. Been unworked for 3 years. I don't know what Denny wants for it, but I know he wants out. The water's good. Caleb looked at him. You know that land? I know every piece of land in this valley. Did you have plans for it? No, Elias said. I was waiting to see what happened to it. He held his son's gaze. I wasn't expecting to have a reason to care about it particularly. Caleb looked at the barn floor, then back at his father. Something in his face was doing the complicated thing it had been doing since the porch conversation, the working through of something that had been stuck for a long time, and was now, slowly, finding the room it needed. We should go look at it, he said. While I'm here, if you have time. I have time, Elias said. They went the next morning, just the of them, on horseback, through the frost-stiff grass of the upper pasture, and into the Denny land at the north end of the valley. Parcel was 300 acres of mixed pasture and timber, with a creek running through the lower quarter and a south-facing slope that would be good for hay. The old Denny cabin was still standing barely, with a roof that needed attention and a door frame that had shifted off square. But the walls were sound and the chimney was straight. Caleb walked through the cabin and stood in the middle of the main room and looked at the low ceiling and the fireplace and the window that looked out south toward the valley floor. He stood there for a long time, the way a person stands in a space they're trying to fit themselves into in their imagination. Elias stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. He looked at his son in the light from the south window and thought about what it would mean, the thing that was being quietly considered in this cold, half-ruined cabin. Not a repair to the past, because the past didn't work that way. Something different. Something that only exists in the direction of forward. It needs a lot of work, Caleb said. Yes, the roof especially. The roof first, Elias agreed. Everything else can wait for the roof. Caleb turned around and looked at him. His face had the expression of a man who has arrived at a decision he's been approaching for a long time, and is slightly surprised to find himself here, at this specific door, making this specific choice. Okay, he said. Okay, I'll talk to Denny. Elias nodded. One nod. He didn't say anything else. He was afraid that if he said something it would be the wrong thing, the sentence that was too large or too small for the moment, and he'd spent enough of his life getting that wrong. So he stood in the doorway of the old Denny cabin on a cold December morning and nodded once at his son, and that was the right size for what it was. They rode back down to the ranch in the thin winter light, the horses moving through the dead grass with the reliable, unhurried rhythm of animals that know the way home. That evening, the last full evening before Caleb and Ruth left, the four of them sat after supper at the kitchen table, not talking about anything significant, talking about the Denny parcel a little, and about the spring, and about Ruth's family in the eastern counties, and about whether the winter was going to be worse or better than last year's, which was the kind of question that is really about something else, entirely about the ongoing negotiation between people and the world they live in, about the eternal human insistence on trying to predict what can't be predicted. Mara had put the good lamp on the table. The kitchen was warm against the cold outside. The four of them sat in the circle of that light, two people who had been building something together for 36 years and two people who were just beginning, and the table held all of them with the same plain wooden patience it had always had. Elias looked at Mara across the table. She was listening to something Ruth was saying, her head tilted slightly, and she didn't notice him looking, which gave him a moment of the kind of looking you can only do when someone isn't performing for your gaze, when they're just being who they are. He looked at her and felt the familiar, undiminished thing that had no better name than love, though the word seemed insufficient for 36 years of evidence. She felt him looking and met his eyes for a second. A second. Her expression didn't change. She looked back at Ruth. He looked at his son. Caleb was talking about something, the road conditions, probably, or the timing of the ride back, and his hands were moving the way they did when he was thinking something through, a habit he'd had since childhood that Elias had forgotten about, and was now remembering with the specific texture of a thing recovered from a long way back. Caleb laughed at something Ruth said, and his laugh in the warm kitchen sounded like the laugh on the morning they'd fixed the window. Full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has stopped bracing. Elias thought about the night on the rooftop, about the geometry of the property, and the decisions made in the dark, and the weight of what had been defended, and the weight of what had been lost in the defending of it. He thought about the man under the horse blanket at the north fence, and he carried that weight the way he carried all the others, not lightly, not without cost, but without being crushed by it, which was the best you could do with certain things. Thought about the years before the ranch, about the man he'd been in those years, and the distance he'd traveled from him, about whether that distance constituted something that deserved to be called redemption, and he decided, honestly, that the word was too clean for what it actually was. It was more like a long, difficult walk in a better direction, with stumbles and detours and no real destination except the next day and the next choice, repeated until they accumulated into something that looked, from a distance, like a life. He looked at the kitchen, at the new window pane, clear in the dark, the shelf where the Winchester sat in its oilcloth, where it would stay. 4 people at the table in the lamplight. This was the thing that had been worth defending. Not an idea of the ranch, not a deed or a water right or a piece of legal standing. This, the specific irreplaceable weight of particular people in a warm room on a winter evening. Table that had seen everything. The lamp that asked no questions. The window that showed the dark outside and the light inside. There was a lesson in it, he thought. Not a sermon. He had no interest in sermons, had lived too long, and seen too much to believe the world arranged itself for moral instruction. But there was something that the week had clarified in the way that extreme circumstances sometimes clarify things that ordinary days obscure. You don't get to keep something by taking it for granted. Not land, not people, not peace, not the daily ordinary miracle of being alive in a world that has no obligation to accommodate you. You keep things by choosing them repeatedly, imperfectly, even badly sometimes, and by doing the daily unglamorous work of maintenance, which is the most honest form of love that exists. The fence posts, the putty knife, the coffee put on before you're asked, the hand found in the dark, the letter sent. The door of the Denny cabin stood in for a long time before the word okay is said. Wasn't a story about a man who fought and won. The fighting was almost incidental. What the week had really been was a clarification, a forced reckoning with what was actually there, what had been built, what it was worth. And the answer that had come back was not a dramatic one. The answer was more than I knew. Quietly, persistently, stubbornly more than I knew. That was enough to work with. That was more than enough. The lamp burned low on the kitchen table, and nobody moved to turn it up. Outside, the winter was doing what winter does in high country, pressing in, closing down, making the inside feel warmer by contrast. The cold crept under the door, and Mara got up and put a towel against the gap, without interrupting the conversation, the way she'd always dealt with small problems, without announcement, without making them into more than they were. Elias Crowe sat at his kitchen table in his 61st year, with the people he loved in the circle of the lamp, and he was not content in the easy sense of the word. He was not without pain, or regret, or the ongoing complicated weight of a long life imperfectly lived. He was something more durable than content. He was clear. He knew what he had. He knew what it had cost to keep it. He knew what keeping it meant, day after day, the patient and necessary work of being present for the life you've built, rather than the life you once imagined you might live. The lamp guttered once and held. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the same impartial persistence it had always had, indifferent to who was down there below it, and what they'd been through, and what they'd managed to hold on to. Stars were out above the ridge, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and the old roan was in his stall with the patience of an animal who has never needed the world to explain itself. The ranch was quiet. It had always been quiet except when it wasn't, And when the lamp finally burned down to its last, it was Mara who got up and trimmed it, and Caleb who banked the stove, and Ruth who carried the cups to the basin, and Elias who pulled the door of the kitchen closed behind them all as they moved toward sleep, and the house settled into the particular silence of a place that has been fully inhabited, where every room holds the weight of living, and every board knows the step of the people who belong to it. Some things you build, some things you fight to keep, some things you wake up to, morning after morning, in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, and understand too slowly, never quite completely, but genuinely that they were always the whole point.